A vivid memory glimmers in her eye, reflecting a distant and painful moment from her past. He had raised his hand with cold authority, commanding silence and delivering a harsh royal decree that severed all personal intimacy, binding her to the formal title of Saint Mira. Far beyond the kingdom's edge, dark beasts gather beneath crackling surges of magical energy along the perimeter defensive barrier. Across the vast horizon lies Roydalis, the capital city, standing tranquil beneath a clear sky. Inside the sacred hall, solemn words remind her that the kingdom's future relies on her light, while energy channels through her glowing catalyst orb. Her attendant Yulia softly announces that morning breakfast is prepared, prompting her to turn with a gentle smile and offer her thanks. Walking together down the grand hallway, she considers the state of the city's defenses. Although the magical barrier remains fully intact, an unsettling surge in monster numbers continues to weigh heavily on her heart. As their steady footsteps echo along the polished floor, she resolves to do everything in her power to ease the anxiety of her people. She sat peacefully, listening as her attendant fondly mused that her upcoming marriage announcement with the prince would bring boundless joy to the people. Moments later, the grand doors opened to admit the prince and his heavily guarded entourage, prompting her to rise and extend a gentle, respectful greeting. Instead of returning her courtesy, he slammed his hand violently onto the table before her, causing a loud thud that startled everyone present. Outraged by his aggressive display, her attendant tried to speak out in protest, but he harshly commanded silence, warning them never to address him so casually again. Without giving her a moment to process the sudden hostility, he delivered a devastating accusation, announcing that the kingdom's true saint had been found and branding her a fraud who would be banished immediately. When she asked if this was truly the king's decree, he coldly reminded her that his bedridden father had placed full regency in his hands, forcing her to quietly accept her grim exile as he walked away with the new saint. Following the tense exchange inside the royal chambers, word of the prince's harsh decision began to echo outward across the high spires of the capital. High above the public square, royal heralds unrolled an official parchment, shouting for the gathered citizens to repeat the decree that stripped Lady Mira of her title and condemned her co-conspirators. Upon hearing the shocking proclamation, the crowd burst into overwhelming confusion and distress, crying out in disbelief as they wondered where their beloved saintess was being taken. An uproar erupted through the square as disbelief turned into hostility, the crowd demanding to know if their beloved saintess had been deceiving them all along. Stunned by the decree of banishment, whispers rippled through the gathering, many unable to comprehend how someone so revered could be cast out in an instant. Enraged by the revelations, several onlookers hurled bitter accusations at her, denouncing her as a fraud while the new saint, Twelly, softly reassured the prince by his side. Screams of rage and fear echoed across the courtyard, warning others to keep their distance lest a curse fall upon anyone who dared touch the disgraced figure. She quietly endured the rain of insults and harsh glares, walking forward with composure despite the malice surrounding her on every side. Rather than offering an angry defense, she offered a polite curtsy to the royal court and simply bade them farewell before turning to leave. Following close behind as they exited the majestic gates, Yulia voiced her frustration, arguing that the citizens were biased from the start and questioning why her lady offered no rebuttal against such harsh punishment. She knew the full truth that the rest of the kingdom remained blind to. Her lady was secretly Princess Mira, the third princess of the Idas kingdom, who chose not to use her royal heritage to save herself. The memory of that past agreement resurfaced, where the king of Roydalis had formally requested her presence as a traveling saintess rather than a royal princess, a role she had willingly and happily accepted. Her own royal relatives had hesitated back then, anxious about sending a young 15-year-old girl into distant lands without protection, yet she had met their concerns with quiet resolve and a gentle spirit. She felt the wind whisper across the open plains as the distant rumble of the outer realm beckoned. Step by step, the exiled princess and her faithful companion put distance between themselves and the massive castle walls, mindful of the grueling journey ahead toward the Idas border. Yulia laid out their next steps, emphasizing the need to stock up on supplies in a nearby town and seek aid at the Adventurers Guild to defend against beasts and lawless bandits. To survive the perilous paths ahead, securing seasoned guardians from among the shrouded figures who frequented those guilds would prove vital. Arriving at the threshold where manicured roads gave way to uncharted wasteland, Yulia offered a final warning, while Mira cast one last serene glance back, offering a quiet wish for her former kingdom's prosperity. Stepping boldly into the unknown, a calm smile touched her lips, unburdened at last by the weight of the crown she had left behind. Preparing for the day ahead, the young princess adjusted her attire inside her quarters, advised that it was time to visit the Adventurers Guild. Once ready in her white hooded capelet, she stepped out into the town, approaching the grand guild house to seek assistance. She stood before the guild counter, only to be informed that the individual capable of helping them had a prior commitment and would not return until the following day. Hearing this, she softly murmured her resignation, realizing they would have to wait. As she turned to leave, a scarred ruffian with a dark eye patch flanked by his companions abruptly cut off her path, insidiously offering to guide them for free if they were in a hurry. Unmoved by his sinister offer, the former saintess offered a tranquil, polite smile, declaring that they were in no rush at all and would simply return tomorrow. Walking away through the narrow, timber-framed alleyways with her attendant, she reflected on how drastically public order deteriorated across neighboring towns, noting with concern that rumors regarding the false saint had already reached this far. Once safely back inside their own room, her companion voiced curiosity about how they could afford the lodging and fine clothes when they had fled the capital with nothing, to which she explained that Lady Ida had secretly entrusted her with precious metals before her departure. She pondered deeply on past events, recalling how a count's territory had been overrun by monsters a decade ago, leaving an orphan child whose holy powers manifested around the same time the southern Ledi kingdom fell. A series of coincidences that suggested a meticulously orchestrated conspiracy. Her thoughts drifted back to the urgent warnings given by Lady Ida in the royal court, who had urged her to step down from her burdens, revealing that powerful forces had been preparing a grand betrayal against the realm for years, and that the crown prince would take responsibility. Sitting beside the dimly lit window as dusk fell, she quietly accepted her new reality with a resolute smile, determined to leave the burdens of state to her brother as she prepared to embark on a long journey tomorrow. She lay quietly in bed as the candlelight flickered nearby, resting before the long journey that lay ahead. As dawn neared, she swung her legs over the edge and placed her bare feet onto the cool floorboards. Standing beside the window, she reflected on her unique power, knowing that no other saintess, not even her own mother or sisters, could manifest a barrier like hers. Without her barrier to shield them, she realized with grim certainty that the nation was destined for complete ruin. Surrounded by silence in the dimly lit room, she paused, feeling the heavy burden of her isolation. Gazing out over the silent rooftops of the town, she questioned whether there was truly no place left for her, or if there was anything she could still accomplish. Navigating the crowded thoroughfare, Raoul took the lead while advising his companions to blend in among the sea of travelers. He observed that many who traveled between the town and the outer regions wore humble, worn cloaks to avoid drawing attention. He turned back with a stern glance, urging them to stay calm and natural as they walked. He explained that a skittish demeanor would attract far more suspicion than any simple travel attire ever could. He reached over to adjust the hood of her travel cloak, tugging it lower to hide the immaculate garments visible underneath. While he reassured her that he had no interest in prying into their true identities, he warned that spotless fine clothes beneath dirty outerwear was a dead giveaway to sharp eyes. He motioned for them to keep up if they wished to avoid trouble before reaching the border, setting a swift pace down the alley. Recognizing the wisdom in his words, the girls quietly followed close behind. Leading them into a busy bazaar lined with outfitting stalls, he suggested they acquire suitable gear and gather local intelligence before setting off on the long journey ahead. As they browsed the market displays, she found a dark hooded cape adorned with subtle cat ears and tried it on. Her attendant immediately gushed over how adorable it looked, though the dark-haired swordsman merely noted its practical coverage. She stood before a mirror adjusting the fabric as he pointed out that keeping the hood pulled up was essential, given how her striking silver hair practically radiated in the crowd. Realizing the danger her unmistakable locks posed, she closed her eyes and tapped into her latent magical capabilities. In a quiet surge of power, her silver tresses began to darken, altering her physical appearance entirely. His eyes widened in utter amazement as he watched her hair change color right before his eyes. When she confirmed it was a clever application of disguise magic, he quietly reflected on how versatile magic was, realizing he shouldn't rush to assumptions regarding her identity. Looking out toward the mountain pass, he weighed the arduous journey ahead. Reaching the Ida's border on foot would take nearly 2 weeks across treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather, making proper preparation all the more critical. He double-checked their preparations, noting that prioritizing preserved provisions would minimize their baggage while ensuring enough food for the 10-day trek ahead. With everything packed and secured, the swordsman gave the signal that it was time to set off, leading the disguised pair toward their waiting transport. As their horse-drawn carriage rolled through the quiet countryside beneath a bright moon, Twell expressed her sincere gratitude to Raoul for taking on the burden of their heavy luggage and guiding them safely. Raoul listened silently from his driver's seat, his sharp eyes reflecting the faint moonlight as he contemplated her words. Observing the sunset glowing against the horizon, Twell admired the beauty of the twilight and remarked on Raoul's striking features, though he admitted others often called his red eyes and tanned skin the colors of ruin. As the wagon continued its rhythmic jostling along the road, their conversation shifted to Raoul's homeland in the Kingdom of Rida and the circumstances surrounding their departure from the royal capital. Twell explained the delicate nature of saintesses, warning that when a true saintess is persecuted or a fake one assumes power for selfish gains, the land itself begins to wither and decay. Considering her explanation, Raoul questioned whether a false saintess might ultimately bring about the downfall of this nation as well, wondering how deeply the kingdom's people truly believed in their revered figureheads. Twell softly acknowledged her own lack of knowledge about the broader world, but Raoul gently reassured her that she had plenty of time ahead to learn everything she needed to know. Deep within the mountainous wilderness, torrential rains loosened the earth, threatening to wash out the mountain passes and block the road for weeks or even months to come. As they assess their path forward, Raoul warns that foot travel around the mountain pass is far too dangerous given the landslides and foul weather, voicing his deep concern for Twell's safety in unfamiliar terrain. Recognizing the wisdom in his caution, she agrees that taking refuge in this town until the main road is fully restored remains their safest and most certain course of action. In response, he casually notes that prolonging the journey is fine with him as long as he is compensated for the extended escort duty, while Maria carefully rolls up a letter to maintain communication with their allies back in the kingdom. Continuing her task, the young attendant speaks warmly of Twell's brother, describing him as a wise, gentle, and composed leader who firmly believes that humanity should refrain from engaging in senseless internal strife. Reflecting on the political storm brewing behind them, she observes that while her brother will eventually face scrutiny regarding her sudden departure, his steady leadership will surely win over the populace and stabilize the kingdom's future. Yet, a subtle doubt crosses her mind as she ponders whether her presence is even necessary for the kingdom's progress, wondering if remaining hidden here is truly the right choice. She urges that they send word back as quickly as possible, fearing that her brother might prolong his own search or make rash moves while attempting to evade pursuit on her behalf. Her thoughts drift back to memories of her mother and the heavy burden placed upon saintesses, recognizing that her brother may be searching blindly for answers about secrets he has yet to uncover. Turning back to their immediate journey, the companions agree to split their efforts, while Raoul takes the circuitous detour road to divert attention. Twell and Maria will press ahead along the mountain trail. Accepting the arrangement as long as his compensation remains secure, he prepares to depart, leaving Maria to finalize her written dispatch in hopes of coordinating a safe reunion beyond the mountain pass. He watched in silence as the attendant bowed her head before her mistress, offering a tearful apology for allowing her to take on the most perilous path. Continuing her emotional farewell, the maid asked for forgiveness regarding her blunt words and prayed fervently for her mistress's safety, to which the young princess softly expressed her gratitude and wished her well in return. Once they were left alone beneath the canopy of trees, the swordsman turned to his remaining companion and questioned how she could place so much trust in him after everything that had transpired. She reasoned that while his earlier advice regarding light travel and changing clothes was practical for his own efficiency, it ultimately stemmed from genuine concern for her well-being, reassuring him that any gaps in his understanding could easily be learned in time. Looking directly at him with unflinching sincerity, she concluded that despite his guarded exterior, his core nature was fundamentally gentle and kind, leaving him rendered temporarily speechless by her unwavering faith. Tragic memories of fire and destruction haunted his dreams once more. In his mind, he relived the moment he was urged to flee and survive, a grim reminder of the fallen kingdom he had left behind. Awakening from the past, he led the young saintess and her loyal attendant along a rugged mountain trail. Spotting a distant woodcutter's hut amidst the trees, he mentally noted it as a landmark indicating human presence nearby. Glancing back over his shoulder, he noticed the young woman struggling to keep pace, her breath coming in ragged gasps under her heavy dark hood. Exhausted by the steep incline, she confessed how different mountain walking was compared to flat ground. Calculating their remaining rations and stamina, he decided they should take a longer, gentler route downhill to rest and resupply over the next 3 days. As her steps faltered completely, her devoted maid quickly stepped beside her, offering gentle words of encouragement and asking if she was holding up all right. Turning to address her, the swordsman advised against pushing herself beyond her limits, while the attendant cheerfully offered to help lighten the burden despite carrying heavy packs of her own. By nightfall, they established camp, where he explained that once they cleared the open plateau, the descent would be much easier on their bodies, complimenting her resilience throughout the day. As they rested by the fire, he warned them about potential monster encounters, explaining how regions far from the capital's barrier were prone to miasma and beast births, threats that ordinary adventurers could slay, but only a true saintess could purify. Later, as the young maid slept soundly nearby, she reflected in silence on words once spoken to her about her true nature, wondering if her gentleness was real or merely a reflection of who she was expected to be. Staring intensely into the flickering flames while gripping his unsheathed dagger, the swordsman brooded in dark solitude, tormented by the painful truth that his homeland had been destroyed by the one known as the true saintess. He sat silently beneath his dark cowl, listening to Maria fret about the tedious administrative obstacles and complications that lay ahead in this new land. Their sharp exchange soon attracted unwanted attention, as a pair of burly, rough-looking guild members sauntered over, offering their dubious assistance with sly smiles. Before the ruffians could press any further, he interjected with calm authority, reminding everyone that as hired professionals, his group would strictly carry out their contract without interference. Relieved by his firm declaration, the young princess felt a renewed sense of security, deeply grateful to have such a dependable swordsman protecting her on this journey. However, the formal commission scroll contained curious details, outlining a dangerous path toward the border of the Ida's kingdom for supposed refugees. Reflecting on the strange contract, the companions recalled how rare it was for a highborn lady to present a massive upfront payment at a secluded guild while keeping her visage carefully concealed. Observing from afar, the guild staff had whispered amongst themselves about the lady's refined air, knowing she was no ordinary traveler and unable to simply abandon her to predatory opportunists. Meanwhile, back in Reuteras, word was rapidly spreading about the unmasking of the false saintess, making the sudden flight of 2 secretive individuals highly suspicious to those in power. Aware that royal hounds and relentless pursuers could already be tracking their trail after their escape from the castle, they knew that any delay could prove fatal. Even with the threat of capture hanging over them, she gazed forward with quiet determination, unable to turn her back on the path she had chosen. She remained low and silent while news echoed through the town plaza, where citizens crowded around official notices declaring her exile and proclaiming Mira as the true saintess. Listening from the shadows of the crowd, her fierce protector glared as townsfolk traded rumors, condemning the false saint while wondering what kind of person the newly elevated Mira truly was. Stepping away through the busy thoroughfare, he kept his head low, surrounded by the desperate prayers of commoners who relied entirely on the saintess to protect them from relentless monster attacks. Their cries for divine intervention highlighted a grim reality. The entire nation pinned its hopes for salvation on a frail young maiden forced to shoulder an unbearable burden. Recalling past battles when violent beasts breached the settlements, he remembered charging into battle without a second thought to carve a path of safety for his companions. With a stern shout, he had scolded the helpless refugees for relying blindly on others, promising nevertheless to guard them until they reached a place of safety. Yet history proved that great power in human hands was rarely trusted, leaving the realm trapped in a fragile cycle between fear of monsters and suspicion of the saintess. Back inside their quiet sanctuary, the companions gathered to re-examine the terms of their mysterious escort mission, haunted by the deep-seated prejudice surrounding holy magic. Their destination was now clear. They were heading toward the domain of Saintess Mimura, the third princess of the neighboring Ida's kingdom. As night fell over the border settlement, they secured lodgings at an inn, planning to restock their provisions early the next morning before venturing into foreign territory. She stood quietly in the shadowed alleyway, observing as her companion kept a watchful eye on suspicious, dark-robed men patrolling the town square. Before stepping out into the street, he instructed her and her maid to wait quietly in place, promising he would return shortly after assessing the danger. While waiting for his return, she reflected gently on how hard he had been working, hoping he could finally rest and eat after spending 3 sleepless nights guarding their mountain camp. Meanwhile, nearby searchers cursed their failure and planned to surround the entire town. The dark-cloaked soldiers spread through the thoroughfare, their presence casting an ominous fog over the unsuspecting townspeople. Systematically blocking the narrow street, they lined up to intercept every local attempting to pass through. They began forcefully accosting young women across the square, pulling back hoods and inspecting hair color to find anyone matching the saintess's description. One startled townswoman barked back at her aggressors in annoyance, utterly bewildered by their rough demands before they cast her aside to continue their hunt. Rejoining her in haste, the dark-haired swordsman led her and her attendant out of the village and up toward the steep hillside, revealing that he had surrendered there in rooms because those searchers were private troops belonging to Earl Diablo. As they picked their way through the dark mountain trail, he explained that the Earl's men were ruthlessly searching for anyone resembling the saintess, meaning that staying in town would have guaranteed their capture. With cold night air enveloping the heights, he warned that lighting a campfire would reveal their location, prompting her to pause and gaze into the distance with quiet concern. She looked up at her brooding companion through the crisp mountain air, asking why he had been searching for a fake saintess in the first place, and why he had gone to such lengths to rescue her. As she waited for an answer, the swordsman remained quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts under his heavy cowl before revealing that he had known her true identity from the very beginning. He confessed that he knew she was neither Olivia nor a mere pretender, but rather Mira, the true saintess of the kingdom of Idas. Standing on the frozen trail beside their supplies, he wondered how someone like her, a genuine saint exiled as a fraud after resolving her kingdom's crisis, had ended up stranded in this distant, foreign land. His mind drifted into darker memories, harboring no hatred for saintesses in general, yet haunted by the absolute solitude that had defined his existence for so long. Abandoned in an unforgiving world, he had spent 10 bitter years surviving day by day without achieving anything, repeatedly praying for help that never arrived until he was forced to rely solely on his own feeble strength. Returning to the present, he gazed down at the young princess sleeping peacefully beside him, marveling at how a girl who had been betrayed and cast out could still place such absolute, unwavering trust in a complete stranger. He realized that her ability to trust others stemmed from an unshakable sense of self, a quiet inner resolve that no betrayal could ever dismantle. A sudden realization struck him as he recalled how the late king of Idas had recognized her as Princess Mira at a single glance, long before his own homeland had fallen. Long before the impostor appeared, the former king of Idas had personally led his forces onto the battlefield alongside Princess Mira, joining hands with her to defend the kingdom from relentless monster invasions. She listened in silence as he reflected on his own youth, how he had cowered behind his elder brother in intimidated silence, deeply admiring the way his brother stood proud and conversed as an equal with the king of Itis. In that memory, the king had cradled her so tenderly in his arms, recognizing the genuine warmth and value of the young princess long before political turmoil swept her away. Returning his gaze to her in the present, the swordsman offered a quiet apology for having feigned ignorance about her true identity during their journey together. Overcome by his sincere confession, she burst into tears, crying out her own apologies for concealing who she was out of fear and mistrust despite his unwavering support. Ashamed of her hesitation, she bowed deeply on the forest trail, reproaching herself for attempting to deceive someone who had been protecting her without asking for anything in return. Seeing her intense remorse, he gave a faint, reassuring response, casually brushing off her doubts as they continued walking side by side. Wiping away her tears, she composed herself and formally introduced herself as the third princess of Itis. With a gentle nod, he warmly re-accepted her greeting, silently resolving to become a warrior capable of holding his head high by her side. 80 years had passed since the last saintess was born in the kingdom of Lloydglass. Historical records revealed that her divine power had been exceptionally faint, barely exceeding the minimum thresholds expected of her sacred office. Because that former saintess originated from humble commoner stock, she faced severe prejudice compared to highborn nobility. Though she had been wed to the king's younger brother in hopes of legitimizing her standing, the union produced no heir, leaving her exposed to harsh ridicule within the court. Addressing his son, the reigning king declared his desire to keep the current saintess tied to the realm as a cornerstone of authority, hoping Prince Arthur would walk toward the future alongside her. Offering a serene, polished smile, the young prince outwardly agreed, asserting that sweeping away the foolish remnants of the old era would restore true hope to the populace. Beneath his composed facade, he privately dismissed the entire premise as utterly absurd. He viewed saintesses not as divine avatars, but merely as ordinary humans possessing unusual magic, viewing the kingdom's fanatical reverence for sacred bloodlines as a foolish tradition that threatened social order. As he held Princess Mimira's hand in public, he reasoned that such individuals were harmless so long as they remained thoroughly controlled and manipulated by those fit to rule. Playing the role of a devoted companion according to his father's instructions, his inner thoughts burned with quiet contempt for the charade of elevating a lowly girl to royal status simply due to a title. Far from the courtly display, a secretive report reached a dark chamber announcing that another potential saintess had been discovered, currently residing with the Count's family under the alias Marie before official verification could take place. Upon hearing the news, the stern noble strictly commanded his subordinates to gather every detail quietly, forbidding anyone from letting word spread to the surrounding area. Driven by his cold ambition, Arthur clenched his gloved hand, determined to eliminate every uncertain element and rewrite the destiny of the kingdom according to his own master plan. He raised his hand with quiet resolve, laying out his plan to wait until the confirmation of the new saintess candidate was absolute before spreading rumors to kindle the hopes of the populace. As he spoke, he glanced back toward Saintess Mimira standing quietly in the hall, declaring that she needed to truly comprehend the gravity of her shortcomings despite his apparent support. Moments later, the young prince stood before the ailing king, who coughed weakly from his bed as he acknowledged that his remaining time on the throne was growing short. Offering a polite and reassuring smile, he assured the bedridden ruler that the kingdom's politics were secure, celebrating the historic arrival of a genuine saintess for the first time in 8 decades. Turning his attention to the high officials, he boldly denounced Mimira as a fraudulent impostor who had manipulated the realm for her own gains. Before the high priest could protest his royal appointment, the prince summoned the royal guards to drag the protesting elder away on charges of treason and madness. With his opposition forcefully silenced, he declared his absolute authority over the court, ensuring that no one would dare challenge his vision for the throne. Reaching out with a sinister glint in his eyes, he privately vowed to eliminate all impurities and claim absolute control over the realm's divine future. Meanwhile, a desperate cry broke through the tension as Maria called out to him in dismay, while Raoul watched the unfolding confrontation with sharp vigilance. Amidst the commotion, A cheerful greeting broke the grim atmosphere as the young companion hailed the prince, bringing the intense confrontation to a sudden pause. His patience had entirely run out as he shouted at Meryl, demanding to know what she was doing 3 days into her official duties. Unfazed by his outburst, she cheerfully offered him tea and mentioned her plans for an afternoon nap, but he flatly rejected her offer, exasperated that she was indulging in tea parties and dress-up instead of showing herself to the populace. He pressed her further, outraged that she had brought in unnecessary personal staff, a home decorator, a private chef, and a manicurist, rather than performing the sacred duties expected of a saint. She defended her actions by explaining that bonding with the temple staff was essential, sharing details about everyone's favorite flowers, snacks, and personal habits to prove she was building meaningful connections. He countered sternly, reminding her that her primary duty was to reassure the populace, inspiring awe and dispelling anxiety rather than indulging in trivial social bonds. She proudly announced that she had already devised a greeting for everyone to perform together, confident that her playful approach would captivate the public. Striking an idol-like pose, she blurted out her grand entrance catchphrase, greeting the world with exaggerated, energetic warmth. He stood completely speechless, stunned into silence by her absurd lack of dignity. Walking down the palace corridor shortly after, he listened as his official expressed deep concern over the bizarre performance on the 3rd day following Mimra's expulsion. He pondered whether Meryl's unrefined behavior stemmed from her upbringing as a vagrant, realizing that her wild antics risked dampening the public's excitement if left unchecked. He raised his hand in frustration, lecturing the unrefined candidate that her elevated position was granted solely to maintain order and communication with the sanctuary, not to indulge her self-indulgent whims. Trembling beneath his stern rebuke, she offered a tearful apology, explaining that she had been completely overwhelmed by how quickly events unfolded after Myra's departure and had lost all sense of proper boundaries. Seeing her total lack of discipline, the prince immediately turned to his prime minister, ordering a surprise inspection of the orphanage where she had been raised to uncover the truth behind her upbringing. While resolving that her basic education would have to be corrected down to the way she slept, his minister brought up a far more urgent crisis regarding the saint candidate and the realm's security. Outside the capital's outer perimeter, hordes of aggressive monsters had begun gathering in massive numbers, effectively preventing merchants and adventurers from entering or leaving the city. Contemplating the alarming report, Arthur realized with dread that the realm's protective barrier was rapidly failing. The high priest confirmed his suspicions, clarifying that ordinary clergy possessed no holy power of their own. The monster surge was occurring because the immense residual magic left behind by Mira was finally dissipating. To maintain public stability, the minister insisted that Meryl would need to perform a public demonstration of monster-repelling power within 7 to 10 days, prompting Arthur to ask how much residual magic actually remained. Gritting his teeth in frustration, the prince recognized that if they were to prevent total catastrophe, he had no choice but to forcefully train the foolish girl into shape. Bringing her straight into the solemn cathedral, he ignored her complaints about the creepy wall paintings and uncomfortable wooden pews, strictly commanding her to sit and begin her prayers. She stood bewildered as the prince laid out his strict demands, insisting that she immediately cast a protective barrier over the grand chapel without any priests nearby to distract her. To ensure her comfort during this crucial task, he had even arranged for her personal belongings, including her favorite cushions, scent sets, and a familiar stuffed toy from her past, to be brought to her before fiercely ordering her to begin without delay. Brushing off his intensity, she posed with flair and dramatically boasted about her indispensable charm, declaring that the people depended on her comforting presence. Her grandiose speech was abruptly cut short when his stern command roared across the room, demanding she cut the chatter and get to work. Striking a majestic pose as if ready to channel divine power, she drew the watchful, expectant gaze of both the prince and the high priest. However, after a theatrical pause, her confidence visibly evaporated. Sheepishly breaking character, she admitted she had no idea how to actually cast a barrier spell in the first place. Her utter ignorance left the prince and the priest speechless in cold disbelief, even as ominous shadowy beasts began gathering along the horizon outside the capital's defense perimeter. News of an unannounced visit from the ruler of Ida's ripples through the royal palace. Prince Arthur reviews the sudden turn of events with his senior advisor, frustrated by how erratic things have become since the arrival of the new saint candidate. She jabbers on enthusiastically in the background, speculating about the legendary visiting monarch and the holy maidens in his entourage, utterly oblivious to the grave political stakes involved. Glaring at her simple-minded optimism, he quietly scolds her lack of calculation, though he recognizes the pragmatic necessity of publicly showcasing her position. She salutes cheerfully, promising to study harder while remaining blind to his irritation. Turning away to head toward the audience hall, he reflects bitterly on how every single phase of his strategy has suffered unforeseen disruptions ever since Meryl entered the picture. Stopping right outside the chamber alongside his advisor, a sudden sense of tension takes hold, prompting him to wonder what awaits them behind the doors. Upon stepping into the room, they are greeted by an imposing figure waiting patiently at the center of the hall. It is King Elroyd of Idas, a formidable warrior monarch who commands his armies directly on the front lines, greeting Prince Arthur with a cool and powerful presence. Inside the grand reception hall, Prince Arthur established his position, clarifying that he was acting on behalf of his ailing father to oversee state affairs. When questioned about the heavy military presence brought into the territory, he smoothly assured the local authorities that his actions were merely a standard precaution to ensure safety and maintain order. He went on to explain that the primary body of his troops remained stationed outside the capital, deliberately positioned to project strength without provoking unnecessary hostility among the noble households. By keeping the main force at a distance, he sought to balance authority with diplomacy while safeguarding their true intentions. Addressing the terms of their agreement, the prince noted how smoothly their cooperation had proceeded regarding the suppression of monsters near the border. He expressed a quiet satisfaction that both sides recognized the mutual benefits of their arrangement, emphasizing that a clear understanding made negotiations far more efficient. As the dialogue continued, his attendants inquired whether he was searching for something specific within the region. He brushed off their subtle probing, shifting the conversation toward the overall stability of the realm, noting that medical supplies and public order were being managed with utmost precision under his direction. His thoughts drifted back to a decision made a year prior, when King Roidas resolved to welcome Meryl as the realm's new saint candidate. After 80 long years since the loss of the original saintess, the kingdom had finally secured a figurehead to restore divine favor and consolidate control over surrounding nations. The presence of the new saint candidate had produced tangible results, significantly reducing casualties during monster outbreaks and accelerating the development of medical practices. From a political and practical standpoint, securing her had proven to be an immensely profitable venture for the crown. With a calm, calculating demeanor, he reflected on how effectively the situation had been manipulated to serve their interests. Every outcome, from public safety to military morale, was proceeding strictly according to the grand strategic plan he helped oversee. Yet, deep down, he understood that King Roidas was simply utilizing the saint candidate as a convenient tool, just as former monarchs had done before him. To the royal bloodline, divine figures were never holy beings to be revered, but strategic assets to be wielded. Memory recalled a haunting exchange with his father, where the king lamented on his throne, declaring himself to be the one truly cursed. At the time, the young prince had dismissed the old ruler's words as nonsense, urging him not to utter such foolish weakness in front of foreign sovereigns. Suddenly, a chilling inconsistency struck his mind, freezing him in place. He paused, intensely questioning his own memory. When had he ever spoken to Elroyd, and why had King Roidas come to mind in that exact moment? He pieced together the disturbing fragments of memory swirling through his mind, recalling how an agreement had been forged between King Roidas and King Elroyd back before Elroyd became bedridden. Why would a ruler grant another kingdom unconditional passage, and what price was paid in exchange? It all hinged on utilizing the saintess. Rumors spoke of 4 saintesses in Idas, the queen mother and 3 princesses, each carrying an innate, noble grace. Yet the saintess who had arrived before him possessed silver hair, matching King Elroyd himself. Cold sweat poured down Arthur's face as panic took root, his heart hammering in his chest while he desperately tried to convince himself that the traveling saint posed no real threat. Yet, under the suffocating weight of King Elroyd's razor-sharp intuition, he felt his carefully crafted plots crumbling before they could even be executed. Seizing the opportunity, Meryl stepped forward with enthusiasm, loudly praising Prince Arthur's brilliance to the monarch, completely oblivious to the prince's inner turmoil. She dramatically accused the false saint, Mira, of orchestrating every obstacle in their path, prompting Arthur to utter frantic whispers behind her to keep up the charade. While King Elroyd listened with a cool, unbothered expression, she poured out accusations against the silver-haired impostor, brushing aside Arthur's hushed attempts to silence her. Her tirade reached a fever pitch as she blamed the fake saint for summoning monsters and causing all their failures, leaving Arthur speechlessly quaking in horror as her wild claims mounted. She went on to denounce Mira as a vile, despicable criminal, completely unaware that her theatrical rant was backing the prince into a dangerous corner. From behind the throne, the king's grand posture dominated the vast hall as the two stood before his absolute authority. Leaning back into his seat with formidable composure, King Elroyd looked down at them with steady eyes, calmly inquiring what had prompted such a commotion. As towering armored knights looked on in silence, Meryl blithely pressed forward with her speech, leaving Arthur trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He stood frozen in place, beads of cold sweat rolling down his pale cheek as the king spoke his name with a heavy, commanding weight. Because of this overwhelming pressure, the prince found himself subjected to a relentless interrogation. King Elroyd systematically disassembled his flimsy excuses, questioning how a simple girl with silver hair could possibly plot such elaborate treason. When the terrified prince feigned ignorance, the monarch reminded him sternly that as regent, the banishment decree bore his signature alone. In response to his feeble stammers, King Elroyd recounted the events of a year prior, revealing that he had arrived incognito at the request of the late sovereign shortly after the prince broke his engagement. He declared with absolute clarity that he had come searching for his sister, Mira, who had been unjustly branded a false saint despite her devotion. As the monarch demanded to know if they possessed any clues regarding her whereabouts, panic seized both the candidate and the prince. While Meryl fumbled for words in utter confusion, Arthur frantically searched his mind for a way to shift the blame. Desperate to preserve his own skin, his eyes narrowed with a sudden, vicious resolve. He told himself that he was blameless and that he needed a scapegoat to divert the king's wrath, landing upon the name of Count Diaglo. With a dramatic outburst, he threw out his hands and loudly proclaimed that Count Diaglo was the true mastermind actively spreading malicious rumors against Lady Mira, claiming they had all been foolishly manipulated by the Count's schemes. However, the king remained completely unfazed by this desperate attempt. Tapping his fingers rhythmically against his arm, Elroyd began quoting Arthur's own past proclamations word for word, exposing the prince's hypocrisy and leaving the surrounding spectators gasping in astonishment. Stepping forward with an intimidating presence, the sovereign noted that while he would not call his predecessor wise, the late ruler at least possessed the resolve to shoulder the burden of his choices, unlike the coward standing before him. Because he viewed the prince as completely beneath him, King Elroyd passed by him without another glance, delivering a final, crushing verdict that Arthur simply lacked the caliber to rule. Overcome by humiliation and despair, the broken prince collapsed onto his knees as royal guards moved in. Meanwhile, the king explained to the astonished hall the reality of the sacred bloodline, noting that a true new saint had emerged in these lands, and that the power to overcome the miasma would belong to the next generation. He commanded Meryl to get along with those present, adding that an official report regarding the matter would be delivered later. As an elderly courtier nervously asked if the monarch was departing so soon, offering to organize a formal welcome banquet, the disgraced prince could only hang his head in silence. Declining the gesture outright, the king declared that he had no further business there and turned his cold gaze away. Behind him, the broken prince collapsed onto his knees on the carpet, leaving the room heavy with the absolute finality of his downfall. As the kingdom fell into turmoil, the populace held on to the belief that Prince Lloyd would return alongside Mira to save the land and lift its crushing burden. However, This growing devotion toward his rival filled him with intense dread, impatience, and despair. Overwhelmed by anxiety, he gripped his head tightly, screaming out in complete denial of his impending downfall. The looming threat of the beast attack only amplified his terror, forcing him to realize how helpless he would be if the people discovered the truth and turned their wrath upon him. Driven into a corner, he frantically gnawed on his thumb, completely unable to comprehend how his once perfect plans had spiraled into total catastrophe. As he struggled to think of an exit, his ally coldly reminded him that seeking external help was useless and suggested pushing forward with their original scheme regardless. Refusing to accept defeat, he began pacing frantically around his room, desperately trying to devise a clever countermeasure to salvage his standing. Interrupting his frantic scheming, the high official stepped forward, advising that their best course of action was to immediately pursue Lloyd and beg for the public's forgiveness. Enraged by the suggestion of surrender, he slammed his fists down in fury, shouting that he would expose Lloyd and Mira before allowing himself to be cast aside. He could only stare in shock as the high official offered a chilling, indifferent smile, completely unbothered by the crisis unfolding around them. Driven to fury by this cold reaction, he lashed out at both the official and the saintess, screaming that their uselessness and ruined plans were bringing destruction upon them all. As his tirade echoed back in memory, she had once stood proudly before them, eagerly displaying the single protective charm she had spent immense effort trying to create. Instead of praising her dedication, he had barked at her in anger, accusing her of foolishly poking a sleeping lion and provoking dangerous attention. His venomous words had only grown harsher as he screamed that if she could not produce a barrier immediately, her very existence was completely worthless. Despite his bluster, the elderly duke stepped forward to reveal the cold truth that the girl was never of noble birth. He continued detailing her origins from orphanage records, explaining how a fallen house had peddled her off under the guise of a saintess just to reclaim lost prestige. Hearing these revelations, she screamed back in defiance, clinging to the promises of a grand life she had been given, while the prince desperately commanded everyone to be silent. He stood paralyzed as the harsh reality broke over him. His deepest fear had always been her uncontrollable power, a force completely alien to the kingdom's rules. Facing his complete unraveling, they stood united before him, pointing out that his panic stemmed from his inability to leash a magic he could never truly control. He screamed at her in a desperate fury, belittling her worth and commanding an incompetent commoner like her to step back. Though shaken at first, Marie turned her tear-streaked eyes back upon him and boldly demanded to know what he, as a prince, was truly capable of doing himself, pointing out that shouting at monsters would never make them go away. Prince Arthur raised his voice in cruel laughter, mockingly pointing a finger at his defeated brother, Lloyd, who could only hang his head in silent despair. Driven by ruthless ambition, he opened his mouth wide to scream a sudden charge of high treason, calling frantically for the royal guards to seize his sibling. As the heavy doors burst open under the sudden intrusion, the disgraced prince looked down, revolted by the sheer vanity and twisted selfishness of those surrounding him. Stepping into the fray, the high official raised his hands in mock innocence, insisting he was merely executing the king's explicit decrees while dismissing any protest as mere foolish nonsense. Away from the grand hall, within a shadowed chamber, bitterness echoed through quiet musings about lost family until a sudden noise revealed someone lurking in the dark outside. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, a panicked crowd gathered in distress, shouting desperate inquiries about the encroaching monsters and demanding the royal family address their fears. Sitting uneasily upon the throne amid the clamor of demanding courtiers, he grew visibly agitated by the absence of his holy maiden, until a sudden hush fell over the entire audience chamber. Reports quickly spread of a mysterious dark-haired maiden who had single-handedly purified hordes of dragons in the north, prompting the newly crowned ruler to realize who had just stepped into his court. Kneeling gracefully before the dais, accompanied by a formidable divine presence, she offered a formal apology for her delayed arrival and introduced herself as Eleanor, the traveling saintess. She pledged her holy strength and life entirely to serving the true monarch, explicitly rejecting earthly titles or fame. while Arthur listened from his seat with newfound confidence. Her sudden appearance felt like divine providence to Prince Arthur, who joyfully declared that fortune itself had favored his cause. Eager to cement his authority, he requested that she remain in the kingdom to lend her immense holy powers to his reign, a proposal she accepted with a serene, unwavering smile, pledging total obedience to his commands. Driven by this newfound alliance, Arthur envisioned himself as a ruler destined for absolute power, framed by the shadow of a colossal beast. Meanwhile, far from the royal court, Raoul and Marie examined dark, corrupted fruit in the woods. Raoul pointed out how the tainted berries emitted a distinct scent that lured beasts, while Marie contemplated the lingering poison affecting the surrounding flora. As they continued their inspection, Raoul noted that the residual aura of a protective barrier was slowly fading from the area. Expressing her gratitude for his sharp advice, Marie followed close behind as he took her hand to guide her through the rough terrain. With dusk fast approaching, he urged her to stay close so they could secure shelter before darkness fully enveloped the forest. Arriving at the market square, the young travelers overheard local tradesmen gossiping about recent shipments and the services of contract mages in the area. As the conversation around them shifted toward rumors of a fake saintess and monster sightings, she could not help but show her surprise, drawing the friendly attention of a nearby vendor who called out to the unfamiliar faces. Stepping deeper into the town, they navigated through the crowded thoroughfares, consulting a map of the surrounding mountain paths to plan their route toward the border. Pausing in a quiet corner to examine the details, he warned her to remain cautious, explaining that their pursuers were still unaware of their precise movements and that any careless mistake could expose them. Curiosity piqued by the earlier chatter, she inquired about the nature of contract mages, prompting him to explain how spellcasters sell their magic skills to businesses, with some operating independently while others served under strict obligations. Their discussion was interrupted by a dark-robed female magician who greeted him with familiar warmth, teasingly offering preserved foods before asking about his young companion. Placing a firm hand atop the girl's head as a gentle caution against her explosive magical tendencies, he bade the vendor farewell and strode forward, leaving her to hurry after him, while lecturing on how magic consumes physical energy and varies by individual talent. Considering her explanation, he noted that the same principles must apply even to a divine figure like the saintess, whose formidable abilities could not possibly render her entirely omnipotent. Turning to face her directly as she carefully folded the travel map, he reaffirmed his solemn vow to protect her until they safely crossed the kingdom's border. Unbeknownst to them, low to the ground and hidden within the shadows of the alleyways, silent eyes were already tracking their every movement through the town. As they reached their accommodations for the night, Raoul turned toward his assigned quarters, announcing his intention to retire. Before he could step inside, Marie reached out, her fingers catching the fabric of his mantle as she softly called his name to pause him. Turning away, she quietly bade him good night and closed her door, locking it behind her. Left alone in his own room, he let out a weary sigh at the long-awaited sight of a proper bed, reflecting on the grueling 5 days of constant travel while keeping a watchful ear out for any pursuers sent by Prince Arthur. Inside her own room, she sat quietly on the edge of the mattress, her mind weighed down by unspoken truths. She felt a sting of guilt for not being completely honest with him sooner, touched by the genuine kindness and silent consideration he had shown her despite the dangerous circumstances. Suddenly, a muffled hiss echoed from the hallway as dark heat concentrated around the iron mechanism of the door, searing and melting the latch into a fused, impassable heap. Amidst the sudden disruption, memories of her mother's stern teachings flashed briefly through her mind, reminding her of the heavy expectations she had carried for so long. Surmising that someone had intentionally sabotaged the entrance from outside, he examined the charred wood around the lock, realizing the scorched mechanism had been sealed tight to trap them or prevent entry. Rushing back to her door, he called out to her by her alias before trying the handle, only to find it completely jammed. Without hesitation, he channeled a surge of magic into his hand to force his way inside. Bursting into the bedroom, he braced for a sudden enemy attack, fearing the worst, only to find her rubbing her eyes in confusion as she groggily asked if morning had already arrived. Sinking back in sheer relief, he wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his racing heart finally settling as she blinked up at him in utter bewilderment. Once the initial shock passed, they inspected the enchanted threshold, discussing how the door's protective barrier had been tampered with despite being keyed exclusively to their individual magic signatures. He pondered the situation with a gloved hand resting against his chin, realizing that they themselves were the true targets, which explained why the lady and her maid had caused no disturbance. She looked down in apology, regretting that her intent to let him sleep peacefully in his own room had instead caused extra worry. He gently reassured her, stating that as long as she was safe, nothing else mattered. Reasoning that a random robbery was out of the question since the intruder specifically targeted their room, he concluded they were being actively pursued. She agreed without hesitation, insisting they gather their things to leave town immediately. Examining the melted lock closely, she identified lingering traces of magical energy, deducing that their assailant was a mage who had used intense heat to force entry. When he questioned if such magic could be tracked, she explained that she could trace the lingering magical thread directly back to the caster. Determined to confront the perpetrator before they fled, she insisted they catch them and demand payment for the damaged door. He smirked in agreement, remarking that magic was not all-powerful and that this intruder would pay extra for the inconvenience. Meanwhile, out on the town streets, hooded observers caught the faint scent of burning from the inn and grew suspicious, just as shocked townspeople pointed skyward at a sudden, terrifying sight. High above the mountains, a massive, dragon-like monstrosity unfolded its colossal wings, looming ominously over the region. The young saintess reflected that blaming the townspeople would achieve nothing. Beside her, the Grand Minister bowed respectfully, admitting that Prince Lloyd still lacked sufficient combat experience to handle unexpected ambushes, much like Prince Arthur who had been swept away during the chaotic battle. She pondered whether activating a protective barrier would suffice to keep them safe, allowing them to rest until the carriage arrived for their journey to Itis. The official continued his grave assessment, explaining that pushing beyond the absolute limits of physical and magical endurance brought an unpredictable physical toll upon the body. Unlike maintaining a standard municipal defensive barrier, overexerting high-level magic during active combat posed severe long-term risks. Meanwhile, far from the formal discussions of state, she sat quietly enjoying a light snack alongside her dark-cloaked companion. Nibbling on her food, she casually questioned why he had taken the trouble to meet her, watching as he silently chewed his own meal before offering a grumbling reply. As they walked together through the town, he brought up the issue of the broken door back at the inn, warning that replacing it would take time and coin. She paused, inspecting an unusual magical residue shimmering on her hand, wondering aloud if it was some high-tier barrier spell or a secret mark left behind by their pursuers. Turning her cheerful gaze back to him, she softly asked why he truly cared so deeply, insisting that if anyone were to take the blame, she alone would bear it. His expression darkened as he turned his face away, muttering defensively that he had only come because he was concerned for her safety. He listened in stunned silence as she animatedly recounted her frustration with the relentless questioning she had endured, admitting that in her haste and irritation, she had accidentally shattered the entrance door by applying far too much force while trying to break free. Her reckless admission only heightened his concern, as his sharp mind connected the dots to Diablo's subtle actions. Realizing that the strange magic on her hand was a signal charm triggered from the inn, he sternly advised her that they needed to pay for the damage while remaining alert for an impending ambush. He pondered the sinister timing of the magic, recognizing that Diablo's subtle spell had reacted precisely when she left, creating a trace for pursuers to follow. She glanced up at him attentively, catching the gravity of his realization as the threat drew nearer. Suddenly sensing nearby hostiles, she placed a gentle finger over her lips, softly pleading with him to stay quiet so they could handle the matter before being completely surrounded. Staring down at her adorable and earnest expression, his heart skipped a beat, thoroughly flustered by her charm. Taking the lead, she urged him to hurry and follow her down a secluded back alley, pointing out that navigating through the quiet side streets was their safest path to escape without drawing unwanted attention. As rumors concerning her status continued to circulate through the dark corridors of power, Saintess Eleanor gloated quietly, spreading word that Diablo's men were scouring the land for the fake Saintess to break a curse. Meanwhile, within the royal hall, Prince Arthur and his high counselors calculated their next move, agreeing that capturing her would solidify their influence while scapegoating her for recent monster attacks and blights. Far from the courtly intrigue, she and her cloak protector found themselves cornered in a cramped alley by masked pursuers who ordered them to freeze and reveal their faces. Acting without hesitation, she unleashed a sudden burst of magical trickery using dried fruits, blinding their captors long enough for them to burst past the perimeter toward the mountain passage. Sprinting across the open fields toward the high ridges, her companion warned that staying on the flat terrain would leave them vulnerable to mounted cavalry, urging them to reach the rugged hills. Right on their heels, riders on horseback closed the distance rapidly, locking their crossbows onto the duo with orders to disable their limbs rather than kill them. Mocking their desperate flight as mere criminals, the horsemen readied their strike, prompting him to draw his blade and instruct her to brace for his command. Before the chargers could reach them, a sudden shockwave shattered the road, tossing carriages aside and throwing the pursuit into complete chaos as he readied a defensive stance. Amid flying debris and scattering horses, he pulled her back from the center of the eruption, shielding her as an overwhelming presence descended upon the trail. A colossal, dark-scaled beast materialized from the destruction, rearing up against the sky as he stood steadfastly between the monster and the maiden with sword in hand. He barely had time to react as massive, membranous wings spread wide across the sky, casting a dark and ominous shadow over the open field. With a sudden burst of momentum, the colossal, scale-armored beast thrusts itself forward through the air, its elongated, spined body surging with terrifying speed. Panic erupted across the encampment as a massive winged beast descended from the sky, casting a dark shadow over the terrified nobles and soldiers below. The sudden appearance of the creature threw the entire court into disarray as screams echoed through the air. Taking action amidst the chaos, he mounted a white steed, pulling her up onto the saddle behind him as the swarming monsters circled above. She held on tightly, calling out warnings as they prepared to burst through the surrounding threat. Galloping across the open terrain, the duo pressed forward as vicious monsters pursued them relentlessly. He kept a tight grip on the reins, determined to cut straight through the enemy lines despite the overwhelming numbers closing in. As they rode, she voiced her distress, realizing that her barrier had inadvertently drawn the horde toward the defenseless villagers. He urged her to stay focused on the present, knowing they had to draw the creature's fury away from the helpless. Reflecting on the harsh realities of their desperate fight, he acknowledged that he could not save everyone by relying on hope alone. Yet, recognizing her unwavering faith and selfless spirit, he knew he would never turn his back on those who needed protection. Memories of past hardships flashed through her mind, reminding her of the times people had blamed her for misfortunes beyond her control. Despite the unjust burdens placed upon her, her desire to protect others remained untouched by malice. Leaping down from the horse with firm resolve, she stood tall facing the oncoming swarm, ready to use her power to shield everyone. Her eyes shone with determination, refusing to allow anyone else to suffer on her account. A subtle smile touched his lips as he acknowledged her courageous choice, accepting her true identity as a genuine saintess in heart. Looking up at the sky blacked out by ferocious beasts, he readied himself for the impending battle. Tightening the bindings around his arm, he quickly calculated their remaining options while bracing for intense physical strain. He realized that annihilating the horde or holding out until reinforcements arrived were their only paths to survival. Unsheathing his massive blade, he charged directly into the center of the monster horde alongside her, unleashing a violent strike to clear the path. Determined to hold the line at all costs, he gave everything he had to protect her, and by crucial time, he advised her to focus on defending herself against incoming magical attacks, while he set out to thin the horde's overwhelming numbers, leaving her to grapple with the rising tide of dragons soaring above. Gathering her resolve in the face of uncertainty, the young saintess decided to channel her energy into a full-power purification spell compressed entirely within her magical barrier. With a decisive shout, She compressed the radiant energy inside the perimeter, aiming to obliterate the airborne beast in one absolute strike. Pouring every ounce of her remaining mana into the light, the sudden surge began pulling the flying monsters straight into its searing vortex, while onlookers below watched in utter disbelief. The compressed holy light erupted across the sky, instantly vaporizing the swarming dragons into harmless ash. As the brilliant glare faded, she landed softly back upon the rocky terrain, breathing heavily after exhausting such immense magical force. The sheer shockwave cleared the heavens entirely, leaving the spectating nobles and priests standing in stunned, awestruck silence. Catching her as her legs gave out from exhaustion, he held her close, leaving her in complete wonder at his steadfast composure amidst the overwhelming force. Expressing quiet relief that the innocent onlookers were unharmed, a deep, unresolved sorrow still lingered beneath her gentle smile. Farther down the trail, frightened travelers and local townspeople looked up toward the distant mountains, whispering nervously about the cataclysmic flash that had just shaken the earth. Prince Lloyd crouches down to eye level, offering gentle reassurance to the frightened children caught in the aftermath of the crisis. He speaks soothing words to the tearful young girl, holding her arms softly while her companion watches on with lingering worry. Word of the miraculous feat spread like wildfire through the crowded town. The villagers babbled in awe and disbelief, recounting how a single girl had vaporized a cataclysmic dragon in an instant, ending the storm of destruction before it even fully began. Echoing the sensational rumors, soldiers and officials debated the sheer impossibility of what had transpired. They argued whether it was mere illusion, as no known magic possessed such destructive power, though none could deny that a genuine miracle had taken place. Amidst the lingering chaos, grateful survivors praised the young girl's intervention. Children cheered for the brave saintess who had protected them, while workers rushed to clear the remaining baggage from the battleground, fully convinced a savior had walked among them. Desperate for answers, search parties inquired among the crowd about her whereabouts. Draped in heavy cloaks, scouts asked if anyone at the scene had seen where the extraordinary young savior had gone after rescuing the convoy. Far from the bustling town, inside a quiet wooden shelter, the young girl slowly woke from her deep slumber. Dazed and disoriented, she opened her eyes to find Raoul watching over her from the dark corner of the room. Rubbing her eyes, she offered a sleepy morning greeting as she sat up in her makeshift bed. He dryly asked how she had slept on straw, pointing out that she needed to get herself cleaned up and ready. He explained that she had been unconscious for 3 full days due to exhaustion, resting in a borrowed shed near a farming village. When she hurriedly apologized and asked about the safety of the attacked villagers, he reassured her and asked if she felt any lingering pain. Examining her hands, she noted that unleashing such immense power without experience had triggered a massive strain on her body. Yet, rather than feeling drained, she marveled at how a fresh wave of strength was now surging within her. Meanwhile, in the village square, reports confirmed that the rescued convoy had loaded their remaining goods and departed for town. Due to her miraculous intervention, not a single life had been lost despite the sheer magnitude of the monster attack. Holding a warm mug, she cheerfully asked if there was any bad news to go along with the good. Looking back at her with dark, deadpan intensity, he coldly revealed that they had lost all of their luggage. He explained that during their frantic clash with Dairo's soldiers, the bag holding all her belongings had torn away and blown into the chaos when she deployed her barrier spell. Confirming that they were now completely penniless, he pointed out the crowd gathering outside their quarters. Townspeople had assembled to shower the miracle saintess with gratitude, forcing him to repeatedly pay for their lodging just to give her a place to rest. He admitted that while he had initially contemplated abandoning everything and fleeing, her quick decision to jump into action had ultimately saved countless lives. Hearing his sincere words, she looked at him in quiet astonishment, absorbing his assurance that every bit of admiration the townspeople offered was entirely deserved. Yet despite the cheers echoing outside, she turned away and confessed the bitter truth stirring within her. She admitted to holding deep resentment toward the people for turning their backs on her in the past, frustrated at her own inability to forgive them or accept their praise without conflict. Reflecting on the heavy burden placed upon her shoulders, Marie recalled the overarching purpose behind her role as the saintess, to stand as a beacon of hope for Roidas while hidden shadows threatened the kingdom's delicate 80-year peace. She had stepped forward alongside Prince Lloyd to undertake her very first duty outside the castle walls, harboring modest hopes that she could truly love and be loved by the common people. As their carriage made its way into the bustling town, the overwhelming warmth of the citizens greeted her, their cheerful expressions eager to celebrate her presence. Watching the radiant crowds wave from every hillside and street corner, she felt a deep sense of connection to these people, convinced that this year of joy would last indefinitely. Yet that idyllic realm shattered without warning, violently severing her connection to the position she had worked so hard to embody. She struggled desperately to maintain her composure amid the sudden betrayal, but Prince Lloyd's expression had turned entirely cold and dismissive toward her. Left utterly isolated before the towering palace gates, she stood surrounded by armed guards as the harsh reality of her public banishment was enforced. Hearing the furious shouts of the populace echo through the air, she endured the full weight of their resentment as they demanded an end to the disorder her presence brought. Despite the harsh condemnation directed at her from every angle, she refused to hold any bitterness in her heart, softly urging that the misinformed citizens should not be blamed. Contemplating how effortlessly the kingdom had embraced the true saintess over her, she quietly questioned whether she had ever been anything more than a convenient, disposable substitute. She recalled the fleeting moment when hesitation cost everything, reflecting on how many people must have believed the rumors about the fake saintess both then and now. Continuing her gloomy thoughts, she admitted that people had simply built up expectations on their own, only to become furious and feel betrayed when she failed to fulfill a duty she never truly possessed. Listening to her self-deprecation, he immediately countered that such treatment was far from normal, recalling how the townspeople had foolishly elevated her as a messenger of heaven while completely losing sight of reason. Looking at her with sudden clarity, he reminded her forcefully that despite how others treated her, she was still fundamentally human. Driven by this epiphany, he began explaining how different she was from the glorified saintess, recognizing that she had never lost her ideals or strayed from her true self even when betrayed, causing him to realize he had been idealizing her image all along. Cast in shadow by his own foolishness, he chided himself internally for failing to see the simple truth right in front of him. Stepping back slightly, he turned away as the obvious distinction between a saintly ideal and a real person settled firmly in his mind. Sitting beside her in the quiet room, he offered a sincere apology, admitting that he had not truly known or understood the real saintess until now. Leaning forward intently, he shifted the subject entirely toward her future, asking what she truly desired for herself right now. A gentle expression softened his face as he encouraged her to speak freely, offering to listen to anything she wanted to do, or even what she wished to avoid entirely. He listened in quiet understanding as she admitted to having just woken up and wanting nothing more than to rest comfortably for a while longer, though she felt fine taking things step by step. Turning her head slightly as the peaceful silence settled between them, she confessed with simple honesty that she was feeling hungry, to which he lightly noted that what a coincidence, he was starving as well. Deeply affected by the loss of the capital's protective barrier, Marie confessed her earnest desire to save every single person without leaving anyone behind. Raoul listened silently as she worried about the innocent citizens left defenseless against the encroaching monsters. She reflected on how her brother had prioritized her safety above all else, choosing to send her away despite knowing the political turmoil and danger it would bring upon himself. Meanwhile, the dark-haired youth pondered the grim consequences if his own strength proved insufficient to avert the looming tragedy. Continuing to open her heart, she explained how deeply the populace was affected by rumors of a false saintess and how her absence had fueled their anxiety. Her voice trembled as she admitted her past ignorance, unable to simply stand by and do nothing now that she knew the truth. Her tone shifted to slight frustration as she pouted over how quickly the public made harsh judgments without knowing the full story. He watched her animated expression, quietly absorbing her indignation. Driven by a sudden resolve, he stood up firmly and proposed that the two of them step forward to rescue everyone together. He declared with bold confidence that he would reveal his true identity and show the world what the genuine saintess of the Ida's kingdom could accomplish. He outlined their new path, reasoning that hiding away and avoiding trouble would never fulfill her true desires. Marking this moment as the start of a fresh chapter in his life within this kingdom, he committed fully to taking action. Turning his attention to other pressing matters, he brought up Twel, reassuring her that despite the lack of contact, Twel was almost certainly safe. He promised to explain the details to her at a later time. He went on to explain that word of a saintess actively saving people would eventually reach her brother, bringing him immense relief and peace of mind once he learned of her safety and location. Gesturing thoughtfully, he acknowledged that while the people longed for her presence, she should remain cautious of those who might exploit her kindness or force unwanted burdens upon her. Looking directly at her with a calm smile, he vowed to act as her sword whenever danger arose. Touched by his unwavering commitment, she asked why he was willing to go so far for her, to which he softly replied that he simply wished to share her noble resolve. He assured her that he would protect her all the way to the border, emphasizing that preventing loss of life was his primary concern. Reassuring her that leaving matters in her brother's hands was not wrong, he urged her to follow what felt right, even if regret lay ahead, adding that he fully believed in her true nature. She pressed her hands to her heart, deeply moved by his unwavering trust. Outside, the villagers noticed her absence, chatting quietly amongst themselves and assuming the saintess was taking a well-deserved rest for the day. Watching over her from the doorway, he remained silent as she stepped out into the open, taking a deep breath and gently adjusting her hair as she resolved to face whatever lay ahead. Casting aside all hesitation, she stepped boldly forward, her dress and long hair swaying in the breeze as she proclaimed her true identity to the world. Mira, the third princess of the Ida's kingdom, standing proudly as the saintess. A giant, dark monster descended upon a helpless village, throwing the inhabitants into pure chaos as parents scrambled to protect their children and men reached desperately for makeshift weapons. Before the beast could harm anyone, the dark-haired traveler leaped into the fray, his blade flashing in a series of swift, lethal strikes that cut through the shadows. With the threat instantly neutralized, he sheathed his weapon and turned toward his companion, reassuring her that the danger had passed as a bright smile washed over her face. Stepping forward before the gathered villagers, the young girl proudly announced herself as Princess Mira of the Kingdom of Idas, claiming that her holy power had purified the land and banished the crisis, prompting relief and awe among the locals who recognized the silver-haired saintess. However, one of the elders spoke up hesitantly, asking if she was indeed the very same Saintess Mira who had recently been branded a fraud and banished from the royal court. Undeterred by the uncomfortable question, she immediately countered with unyielding conviction, declaring to everyone present that her exile was nothing more than a giant misunderstanding. Watching her handle the crowd, her quiet protector considered the situation, knowing he needed to carefully choose his words to support her story without exposing unnecessary truths or creating panic. Seizing the momentum, the girl elaborated that in her time of need, she had sought aid from Vincent, the skilled swordsman beside her, who had willingly answered her call to assist her journey. She further clarified the state of her entourage, explaining that royal soldiers were maintaining a base nearby and mentioning their artisan allies, putting to rest any suspicion about her lack of a formal military escort. Reinforcing her narrative, the dark-haired warrior stepped forward and smoothly confirmed every word she spoke, presenting himself as a trusted guard closely connected to the crown and cementing their credibility in the eyes of the villagers. He watched in silence as she reflected on the weight of her words, recalling how she had determined to never turn away from those in need. Though her power had limits, she remained steadfast in her commitment to speak the truth and aid the populace however she could. She offered a bright, reassuring smile to the tearful villagers, declaring herself a true ally to the common people while her companion readied a horse for their departure. She gently turned down the villagers' urgent pleas to stay and rest, explaining that the protective ward she placed would keep them safe, while other distant settlements still required immediate rescue from beastly threats. She offered a final wave of farewell from atop their mount, promising that they would surely meet again as they set out on the road. Before she could proceed, the private soldiers who had earlier threatened her life prostrated themselves on the dirt, trembling violently and begging for mercy now that her true identity was undeniable. He seized one of their sturdy horses along with their coin pouches as payment for their transgression, riding off alongside the princess while the defeated soldiers sobbed over their losses. Watching the duo vanish into the distance, the village chief and his companions resolved to spread word across the land of the real princess who had saved them. Amidst the bustling crowd, chatter spread rapidly regarding the young noblewoman. The townspeople eagerly discussed how aligning themselves with Lady Mira was the wisest path forward, praising those who stood against the low-born thugs who had dared disrespect her royal status, all while speculating on the rewards that awaited them. As a consequence of this growing support, whispers circulating among the villagers turned to the sophisticated nature of her spell work. They marveled at how effortless her barrier magic appeared, whispering that such refined craft required no grand gestures, firmly cementing her standing as a figure of incredible arcana and wisdom. Offering a warm, serene smile to the gathered villagers, she expressed her deep relief that none of them had suffered harm. In response to her solemn vow to return whenever beasts threatened their safety, the grateful citizens declared that they would no longer fall victim to deceptive rumors or fraudulent claims. With their trust fully restored, the populace openly acknowledged her true lineage, hailing her as Princess Mira of the Ida's kingdom. The surrounding crowd nodded in agreement, affirming that her noble bloodline and genuine compassion could no longer be questioned by anyone. However, not all were swept up in the admiration, as an angry voice suddenly barked out against the prevailing mood. Clenching his fist in protest, a dissenter shouted to the crowd, desperately reminding them that Mira was nothing more than an impostor who had repeatedly deceived the entire realm. In response to his outburst, the surrounding citizens immediately pushed back, pointing out how the former Saintess Marie had merely attempted to claim unearned glory while hiding her true condition. They argued that prestigious figures had already recognized true power, suspecting that any past slander was merely the lingering effect of a malicious curse. As the debate spread into nearby thoroughfares, men gathered in hushed circles to dissect the recent anomalies. They questioned how the dragon had been vanquished so far from the capital, wondering aloud if the destroyed carriages and missing cargo had all been clever illusions designed to obscure high-level political scheming. Amidst these conspiratorial theories, an eyewitness stepped into the center of the discussion to set the record straight. He declared that he had been present during the terrifying dragon attack, witnessing firsthand how Lady Mira had boldly rushed to their rescue, which prompted others to question why the young high priest had abruptly sealed off access to the capital. Observing this dramatic shift in public sentiment from a secluded corner, he listened intently to the chatter of the marketplace alongside his companion. Recognizing that public opinion in the city had irrevocably turned in their favor, they quietly agreed that it was time to report these critical developments directly to Prince Lloyd. Reflecting on how drastically circumstances had transformed from the past, the young prince and his allies looked out upon the changing tide of the city. With Lady Mira now widely celebrated and her former detractors silenced, the path forward had been rewritten, setting the stage for their next decisive move. Night had fallen over the rugged terrain, leaving Raoul and Marie to seek refuge beside a flickering campfire. As the embers cast long shadows against the cavern wall, he quietly observed his young companion slumping sideways, thoroughly exhausted by the day's relentless trek. Because of her obvious fatigue, he checked their travel map and estimated they would reach the next town when the sun reached its zenith the following day. He inquired gently about her physical condition, to which she admitted with a weary sigh that the journey was taking its toll. Sipping warm tea from her cup to ward off the night chill, she reflected on the resilience of the surrounding territories. She noted that despite 80 years under the shadow of constant danger, the local villages remained surprisingly vibrant, prompting him to remark that her purifying presence had lifted the dark miasma hanging over the land. Her thoughts drifted back to the grim chatter of the villagers they had encountered along their path. They had spoken with hardened resignation, convinced that their land was permanently cursed from the times of their ancestors. To those common folk, it made little difference whether a saintess was present or not, as survival meant enduring the heavy burden regardless of divine intervention. Returning his focus to the documents and parchment maps spread between them, he turned the conversation toward the political turmoil brewing in the capital. He warned that it was only a matter of time before the populace realized the kingdom was unraveling under Prince Arthur's reckless control, reminding her that she would eventually need to return while the king remained bedridden. In response to his warning, she mused about the second prince, Jader, Arthur's half-brother, wondering if he was currently situated within the royal castle. She confessed that she knew nothing of his whereabouts or appearance, having fled before his arrival, though a faint sense of expectation still lingered in her mind. Before their conversation could progress further, he suddenly stiffened, sensing an intruder breaching the outer perimeter of his detection barrier. She turned sharply toward him, relaxing only when he confirmed that whatever was approaching was not a monster. Seeing small silhouettes emerge from the shadowed trees, she immediately dropped to her knees, greeting the approaching children with a soft, reassuring voice. She introduced herself as Princess Mira of the Lays Kingdom and asked if any of them needed medical attention. Listening to their tearful explanation, she learned that no adults were present because the elders had been injured and separated during their flight. Moved by deep compassion, she assured the youngsters that they were safe now, while he quietly scanned the surrounding woods to ensure no further danger lurked nearby. She watched in shock as a disheveled young noble stumbled out of the woods toward them. The children instantly recognized him as Prince Jader, relieved to see him unharmed. Catching his breath, the royal greeted her, stating it was an honor to meet Saintess Mira, while Raoul silently questioned why the second Prince of Roidas would be in a place like this. Before anyone could process his sudden arrival, the exhausted prince collapsed to the ground, only to push himself back up and press a hand over his heart. Looking directly at her with desperation in his eyes, he blurted out a sudden proposal, begging for her hand in marriage, leaving both her and Raoul completely speechless. The long journey back to the village finally came to an end as the peaceful valley stretched out before them, nestled beneath towering mountain peaks. As they stepped into the settlement, the local villagers gathered warmly to greet Jader and his companions, marveling at the presence of both Saint Mira and the royal prince. Standing outside one of the rustic cottages, the prince suggested to Jader that they speak in private once the injured were examined, proposing they share a meal together afterward. Inside the quiet house, the village doctor concluded his examination of Mira, assuring everyone that rest would restore her strength as he bowed deeply in heartfelt gratitude. With her health confirmed, Prince Raoul produced his royal signet ring, removing any lingering doubt Jader held about his noble lineage as they prepared to discuss the crisis. Addressing the group gravely, he explained that national prestige must be set aside to counter the monster threat, acknowledging the chaos bound to follow his elder brother's sudden disappearance. Driven by his duty to the realm, he swore that Mira's selfless devotion to protecting the people would not be in vain, a commitment Jader was greatly relieved to hear. Lowering himself onto one knee before her, the prince offered a formal apology for the kingdom's past transgressions and expressed his deepest thanks for her heroic protection. Gently urging him to stand, she assured him that his willingness to carry the burden was more than enough, insisting that confronting the monsters was simply her personal choice. Yet, despite her calm demeanor, a slight flush rose on her cheek as a lingering question resurfaced in her mind regarding his casual mention of a marriage proposal. She waited silently for his response, watching as the prince's playful demeanor vanished, replaced by a grave and calculated composure. Addressing the weight of her inquiry, he explained that a union between their houses was the surest way to halt the deteriorating relations between their two kingdoms, bringing much-needed reassurance to the populace. Although he acknowledged that such a political decision ultimately rested with her royal brother rather than herself, she softly affirmed her understanding, even as her guardian looked on with evident confusion. Shifting the mood, he gestured gracefully toward their surroundings, insisting that allowing her to leave without proper hospitality would be disgraceful, warmly requesting that both she and her guardian grant him the honor of entertaining them for a brief respite. Delighted by the gesture, she graciously accepted his invitation, asking only to hear more stories about the resilient village and its people while the young locals tended to their daily chores around them. Before long, the group gathered around a feast provided for the community, where the local youths recounted how they had survived by gathering wild plants and fishing, refusing to abandon one another even when monsters encroached upon their home. As they shared the warm meal, the conversation turned toward her dark-haired guardian, whom the locals praised for teaching the abandoned children how to survive, while he quietly explained that he had initially come merely to visit his convalescing mother. Listening intently, the young noble marveled at how efficiently they had driven off the nearby monsters before nightfall, promising to immediately dispatch messengers to call back the displaced villagers who had fled the terror. Surrounded by the cheerful chatter of the children, the young maiden listened as they eagerly asked if she would soon be reunited with her mother, to which the prince offered a gentle reassurance, prompting the kids to curiously inquire about her guardian's future as well. Meanwhile, the elderly village doctor approached with fresh provisions, insisting on taking charge of sending word to the refugees and declaring that he could not rest while the young ones worked so tirelessly. He recounted his struggle as a humble porter, explaining how he lost both his guards and cargo during their frantic escape, leaving him completely penniless. Jader bemoaned his own lack of funds, while Mira noted with relief that the beasts had not reached this far, sparing the prince and the local children from harm. She listened intently as he detailed the strict physical limits of barrier magic, warning that shielding an entire town was unrealistic and that maintaining highway barriers would drain her energy rapidly. He added that connecting irregularly shaped barriers carried unpredictable risks, leading her to realize how dangerously dependent the region's security would be on her alone. She offered a quiet apology for not arriving sooner, weighed down by the heavy responsibility placed upon her. However, the old doctor quickly dismissed her self-blame, reassuring her that the crisis stemmed from a desperate shortage of manpower, as exhausted guards and local private forces had completely abandoned the highways. He had made the severe manpower shortage clear, leaving her and Prince Raoul to step outside into the quiet village air. Standing together beside the rural chapel, they looked out across the peaceful countryside, quietly contemplating the daunting challenge of restoring order to a realm bereft of defenders. Gathered outside near the village homes, the grateful townsfolk offered heartfelt thanks for the warm meal and peaceful moments shared together. With a gentle bow, the young maiden announced that she would begin preparing for their departure, prompting the noble prince to agree with a quiet nod. She paused, turning back to the group with a humble request to remain in the village as residents for a short while longer. She saw how her proposal caught the surrounding group off guard, though the prince quickly acknowledged the logic behind it. He admitted that endlessly hunting monsters while tracking intelligence had its limits, making a permanent stronghold highly practical. He listened attentively as his dark-haired companion explained that this location was geographically ideal for detecting threats near the surrounding barriers while securing the nearby travel routes until full order was restored. He watched as his assessment brought an outburst of joy from the village girls, who cheered at the prospect of keeping both the revered holy maiden and the skilled swordsman nearby to protect and assist their community. She turned toward the warrior beside her with deep respect, expressing her wish to rely on his judgment before finalizing their plan. Before he could respond, the young prince offered his own assistance, prompting the delighted maiden to declare that she was now officially an inhabitant of the village and eager to prepare her quarters. She was instantly swarmed by excited village children pleading to share sleeping space with her, while the stoic warrior excused himself to inspect and maintain his broadsword at the forge. He paused in the shadows, his expression turning grave as his mind focused sharply on Prince Raoul. His thoughts lingered on the noble royal's background and dignified demeanor, reflecting on the complex circumstances surrounding the prince's house arrest, family visits, and hidden motivations at the blacksmith's shop. As he listened intently, the young prince laid out the political web in the capital, describing how his mother had been placed under house arrest while the king lay bedridden, leaving the elder prince free to plot Myra's exile. Continuing his explanation, Raoul revealed that he had outmaneuvered his guards to secure his mother's safety before making his way toward the capital, which ultimately led him to this very village. A heavy silence fell over the prince as he confessed his own shortcomings, lamenting that as the second prince, he had failed in his fundamental duty to protect the children. He reflected on how Mira had been falsely accused and exiled, yet she still took it upon herself to care for the young ones, allowing them to live self-sufficiently despite the option to return to the capital. The prince went on to describe the turmoil that followed: the king's sudden collapse, the collapse of government affairs, and the rise of monster outbreaks that forced them to rely on Myra's help once more. Burdened by guilt, Raoul admitted that missing his chance to act sooner left him with no right to make demands of her, feeling that asking for her aid now was a disgrace. Cutting through the heavy mood, Jader spoke up calmly, assuring him that he had already seen through the situation, adding that Mira and the children likely understood it as well. Mira blinked in surprise, caught off guard by Jader's straightforward assertion. He casually reasoned that trying to stop Mira directly would only make her stubbornly resist, so the prince's humble request was actually the most effective way to reach her heart. Looking at her earnest expression, Jader concluded that Raoul's plea was made precisely because he understood her gentle nature, knowing it was the only way she would agree to stay. As she listened from nearby, Jader reassured the young prince that taking time to prepare for his moment of responsibility was not an excuse, privately reflecting on how remarkably similar the noble's inner struggles were to her own. Prompted by the elder warrior's understanding, the prince confessed that he had long harbored a quiet admiration for the saint, explaining that when he finally witnessed her light in person, her presence matched his cherished expectations so completely that he had blurted out his plea impulsively. Blushing deeply at his own vulnerability, he admitted with a faint, embarrassed look that he had never experienced such an overwhelming surge of emotion in his entire life. Attempting to save face, he hastily explained that he had framed his request as a cold political maneuver only to avoid unsettling her, asking if Jader had seen through that facade as well. The warrior merely turned away with a dry smile, offering to pretend he had never heard the embarrassing confession. Across the quiet settlement, word of the recent ordeal had spread far and wide, drawing people together in front of the village sanctuary. Moved by the urgent call for aid, local adventurers and villagers gathered in great numbers to offer their strength to the recovery efforts. Among the crowd, 2 eager volunteers stepped forward, pledging their labor as a token of heartfelt gratitude to the young saint who had saved their lives. Joining forces without delay, the workers threw themselves into the task, clearing away heavy debris and splintered timber from damaged structures. Nearby, the second prince stood beside the dark-haired guardian and the young maiden, meticulously reviewing restoration blueprints with local elders. Through their combined labor, tranquility slowly returned to the countryside, with restored homes standing peacefully beneath clear skies. When night fell over the peaceful valley, the dark-haired guardian took up his vigil atop the high lookout tower, calling down lazily when he heard a quiet knock below. He looked down over the wooden railing, only to find the gentle maiden smiling up at him with a glowing lantern and a basket full of late-night snacks. She climbed up to join him in the cozy watch post, warmly offering the hot food as they shared a comfortable moment under the starry sky. He listened attentively as she marveled at how rapidly the village was rebuilding, noting that the influx of volunteers had not only restored the homes and fields, but had even allowed them to expand the outer barricades. The village elder agreed, noting that their once vulnerable settlement was rapidly becoming one of the safest places in Reuterus. She remembered how Prince Raoul had managed the rowdy adventurers, stepping in to defuse potential conflicts before they could escalate. Both of them recognized the prince's sharp intellect, as handling free-spirited mercenaries required a delicate yet firm hand. Turning her eyes back to him, she recalled with fondness how he had faithfully stood guard whenever she healed the wounded or dispelled lingering spiritual miasma. Even while exhausted, his constant, reassuring smile had given her strength and no small amount of embarrassment. He smiled back, leaning his head against his hand as he candidly admitted that watching her selfless devotion was his greatest source of energy. Seeing her so full of life during those moments had left him utterly filled with admiration. The doctor had also mentioned how merchants across Reuterus were rethinking their plans, amazed that a kingdom on the brink of ruin was suddenly stabilizing. Even the town guards had regained their spirit, inspired by the unprecedented turn of events where the true saint's exile had brought light back to the lands. Holding a warm mug of boiled sweet bean tea, she took a quiet breath under the starry night sky, reflecting on how much had been restored and reassuring herself that things would continue to mend. Looking at her with gentle warmth, he softly encouraged her to speak whatever was on her mind, assuring her that he was ready to listen for as long as she needed. She chuckled softly, commenting on how Prince Raoul always seemed to see right through everyone's thoughts, to which he teasingly replied that she herself had grown a bit more headstrong recently, drawing a playful protest from her. He acknowledged her foresight and wisdom, knowing she would never venture out alone late at night without a clear and deliberate purpose in mind for what lay ahead. Outside the quiet watchtower, the night stretched across a peaceful village where monster attacks had dropped back to manageable levels. Yet while the people's trust in her grew stronger each day, whispered doubts about the royal family were spreading across the realm, a clear sign that time was rapidly running short. She knew that Jader had already begun laying the groundwork alongside the village mediator, relying on connections with sympathetic nobles in the capital to ensure a safe return without unnecessary risks, while explaining their temporary departure to the villagers. Turning toward her companion with quiet resolve, she declared that she would accompany him to meet Lord Arthur. Elaborating on her decision, the young woman explained that over a month had passed since the landslide, meaning the blocked mountain path should finally be passable. She noted that the capital's lockdown might have been triggered when she dispelled the barrier, making it essential to assess the situation quickly. Furthermore, information suggested her brother had visited the capital at least once, and though Lord Arthur's life was spared, his current fate remained uncertain. Believing this might be their only chance to speak with him, she refused to remain in the dark about the true motives behind these events, determined to see the truth with her own eyes and reach a final resolution. Addressing the complex situation at the capital, Prince Raoul proposed that their immediate priority should be joining forces with Prince Royd, though he admitted feeling a subtle lingering suspicion about how conveniently the circumstances were unfolding. In response, he firmly declared that he intended to meet with Prince Arthur himself, stepping forward without hesitation to voice his commitment to the alliance. Revealing the ring engraved with the emblem of the divine wolf, he explained that presenting proof of survival from multiple royal bloodlines would provide indisputable evidence of legitimacy when making contact. Turning his attention toward Mira, he gently confessed that he could hide nothing from her, recalling how he had actually met her years ago when visiting the Liadai territory alongside the former king. His memory transported him back over a decade, recalling an overheard conversation between King Idas and her father regarding a profound secret surrounding her birth. In those distant days, her elders had spoken of her being born with a special mission as a holy maiden, though the full extent of that fate had remained unclear to him at the time. Looking gently into her eyes, he assured her that her drive to help others was not born of an imposed duty, but rather from her own genuine empathy and refusal to turn away from suffering. Around them, the surviving townspeople exemplified that same resilient spirit, striving to move forward together despite the heavy shadow of fear and uncertainty lingering over the land. Prince Raoul reflected deeply on Arthur's character, expressing a profound desire to understand how his fellow royal faced the people and carried his burdens as a true leader. Adjusting his mantle with resolute resolve, he silently acknowledged Raoul's noble intentions, ready to face whatever answers awaited them ahead. As he rested alongside his companions, the former prince looked back on how his homeland had been destroyed after placing its faith in a saint, acknowledging that the present kingdom had almost met the same tragic fate. Because of those past catastrophes, faith in saints had completely vanished, leaving those who truly possessed divine powers trapped in suspicion and hardship. Having lost everything he once believed in, he had wandered as a mere adventurer, unable to place trust even in himself. Even when he reached out to help others during those dark years, the acts brought him nothing but deep self-loathing. Consumed entirely by the struggle to survive, even his desire for vengeance had withered away, leaving him taking a simple bite of food in quiet resignation. Taking a sip of water, he turned toward Mira and admitted that everything changed the moment he met her. Recalling how she selflessly helped everyone around her, he described how joyful she appeared whenever she acted out of pure kindness. He confessed that he had long believed saints were inherently wicked, but watching her laugh, express anger, make snacks, and hand out water reminded him of what a true saint ought to be. Explaining that his recent conversation with Jader had helped solidify his resolve, he announced that he too had finally made up his mind. He declared that once he escorted Miras safely to the border, he would return to Liadai, determined to serve his ruined homeland in whatever way he still could. He confirmed softly that rebuilding his homeland was indeed the path his heart called him to follow, while she smiled warmly in understanding. As his determination settled into place, the dark-haired guardian turned his gaze to the young maiden, expressing profound gratitude for having met her, a heartfelt sentiment she readily echoed. She then pondered aloud how she might contact her elder brother, catching herself with a nervous chuckle at how much like a final farewell their conversation sounded, though her companion assured her that reaching out would be simple enough in this village. As their carriage pressed forward through the quiet landscape, she quietly admitted her dread of what the future held now that this chapter was closing, but he gently reminded her that everyone must ultimately choose their own destiny. Upon arriving at the overcrowded shelter, tranquility gave way to sheer pandemonium as wounded refugees flooded the medical station, forcing the helpers to divide light injuries, while cautioning her not to exhaust her holy healing power all at once. Kneeling beside a severely injured survivor, she struggled against spiraling thoughts of self-doubt before forcing herself to focus, only for the dying man to weep and beg for her forgiveness for ever having doubted her during her time in the capital. Shock washed over her features as the wounded survivor gasped out a devastating truth. The royal capital had been completely destroyed. Under the influence of the new religious authority, the royal court enacts drastic decrees, seizing the citizens' wealth and replacing long-standing officials under the guise of spiritual purification. Gates across the capital are promptly sealed, imposing strict travel restrictions to lock the populace inside under the pretense of containing spiritual pollution. Inside the castle, Prince Raoul strips corrupt nobles of their titles, sentencing former allies to the dungeons on charges of high treason. Turning to his loyal royal guards, he orders the immediate disarmament and disbandment of all private mercenary forces, declaring anyone who resists a traitor to the realm. Meanwhile, uneasy whispers fill the administrative halls as lower-ranking ministers tremble at the unprecedented severity of the crown's new orders. Eliano proposes a gruesome strategy, asserting that lining the outer ramparts with the stacked corpses of slain monsters will deter further beasts through sheer terror. She parades through the city streets, convincing the desperate townsfolk that traditional purification was a delusion and that her brutal methods alone can eradicate the unseen poison. Behind a serene countenance lies calculating ambition as she publicly vilifies her predecessors, framing her dark campaign as an act of selfless truth. Throughout the markets, fear and hardship spread rapidly among the citizens, who find themselves unable to trade, communicate with family, or challenge the totalitarian regime. Ecstatic with absolute authority, Prince Raoul throws his arms wide, fanatically declaring that Reuteras will rise supreme over all calamity and crush any who dare oppose them. He shouted wildly, declaring that everything would be fine so long as Saint Eliano was with them. But his frantic expression froze as he realized the truth. Eliano was missing. Reports from his council confirmed the worst. She was nowhere in the castle or temple, leaving behind untouched belongings and unfinished works. Sweat poured down his face as he ordered a cover-up, but a guard interrupted to reveal that the populace had already witnessed her departure. She had casually bidden farewell to the kingdom before walking right out through the capital gates. Stripped of his divine backing, the prince stood paralyzed in utter disbelief. Outside, furious crowds assembled at the castle gates, screaming demands for their money back and denouncing the regime as a fraud. Amidst mounting casualties, food riots, and total anarchy, he could only stare blankly as his ideals dissolved into madness. Guards barked threats of treason at desperate citizens who attempted to burn the piles of decaying monster corpses. Darkness enveloped Reuteras, leaving the capital smothered under mountains of rot and the embers of revolution. Shadowy despair engulfed the capital, blanketing the city beneath a suffocating pall, while a solitary figure watched the collapse from high above the palace walls. Faced with the burning wrath of his people, Prince Raoul refused to accept responsibility, desperately repeating to himself that none of this ruin was his fault. As his authority crumbled, a horde of pitch-black beasts descended upon the streets, tearing through the helpless populace who screamed out in sheer horror. In a desperate bid for survival, The aristocrats slammed the heavy iron gates shut, sealing themselves inside, while ignoring the panicked cries of the citizens trapped outside. The chaos spread unchecked across every district, driving families to flee as dark forces demolished homes and swept through the crumbling city. Escaping through an ancient secret tunnel used only when nations fell, he crawled out into the wilderness and watched the plumes of smoke rising from his ruined capital. Walking aimlessly into the desolate woods, he succumbed to total despair, wondering where he could possibly run now that his father was gone and his realm was destroyed. Pausing in his flight, he realized the monsters were not pursuing him and held up the protective amulet he had confiscated from Marie, wondering if its magic was safeguarding his escape. Regaining a glimmer of resolve, he pulled his hood over his face and set his sights on reaching the nearby settlement of Tamatriza before nightfall. Emerging from the dense forest, he came upon an encampment of travelers and refugees gathered around campfires, offering a temporary sanctuary amidst the surrounding chaos. He pulled his travel cloak tight around himself, unsettled by the sight of rough, disreputable vagrants lurking so close to the royal capital while the roads remained blockaded. As the ruffians panicked among themselves over the pitch-black miasma rising in the distance and debated whether monsters were devouring the capital whole, he realized this sudden commotion offered him a chance to slip past unnoticed. However, before he could make his getaway, a harsh voice hailed him from behind, demanding to know why he was in such a rush. The bandits immediately surrounded him, taking one look at his pristine garments and jewel-encrusted footwear to deduce his noble origin, greedily dismissing any explanations he might offer as they demanded his wealth. Stripped of his valuables and forced to flee into the dark forest, he ran desperately while questioning how his life had fallen so far, recalling his pampered childhood surrounded by royal luxury and absolute devotion. In those early years, he had genuinely envisioned himself as a brilliant light destined to guide the realm into a prosperous future. That idealistic dream shattered when his beloved mother fell gravely ill, confined to her bed while solemn courtiers hovered in helpless silence. Following her passing, heartless rumors echoed through the palace walls, with nobles claiming her tragic end was retribution for her tyrannical behavior and cruel treatment of rival concubines. Though he harbored an intense, hidden contempt for the short-sighted court officials who mocked her memory, he masked his spite behind a cold and calculating resolve. His royal mentor had instructed him never to let human frailty dictate his choices, warning that mortals were naturally complex and ugly, and that a true sovereign must firmly direct them rather than succumb to pity. He remembered his childhood, standing dutifully before his father, nodding respectfully as the king placed a heavy hand on his shoulder while quietly admonishing him not to deflect responsibility. Because of this memory, the king's empty platitudes about his late mother rang hollow, leaving him disgusted by the royal weakness and cowardice that refused to speak the bitter truth. As he walked through the castle grounds back then, whispers of resentment followed his every step, with bitter noble factions looking down on him as a cursed child of weak lineage. The common people were equally unforgiving, openly mocking his family as frauds and expressing deep anger at having ever looked up to such figures. In response to their contempt, he learned to view such fickle public affection as a mere tool to be manipulated and kept firmly within his grasp. Even when a gentle girl offered him kindness in the past, he clicked his tongue and turned away, unwilling to trust anyone in a world built on deceit. Snapping back to the harsh present, the young prince staggered through the icy wind, his ragged cloak barely keeping out the chill as he clung desperately to survival. Nearby, a couple of rough-looking refugees shared a dry piece of bread, offering a portion to one another and expressing grim gratitude that they had at least made it out alive. Around the makeshift camp, weary citizens discussed their dire situation, noting that the nearby town had barred its gates and complaining that the kingdom had no military left to protect them. They resolved to press forward toward the northern border while conserving their strength, fully aware that the pursuing forces on exhausted horses were still far behind, but that their own journey remained perilous. Amidst the traveling crowd, whispers echoed that Mira was indeed the true saint, currently aiding villagers in a settlement beyond the mountains. Disguised beneath his hood, Prince Raoul quietly listened, processing the rumors regarding her whereabouts. Before he could fully process the revelation, a sudden panic seized him as a colossal, dark monster unexpectedly emerged, threatening to shatter the fragile peace. Prince Raoul reflected on the dire circumstances, explaining that the beasts had not initially targeted humans, but were instead pushed forward by the overwhelming surge of newly appearing monsters. He explained that those seeking safety fled toward higher ground or sturdy structures like the castle, which allowed many to survive despite the widespread devastation. Continuing his account, he described how citizens abandoned the royal capital by any means available, whether traveling by horse carriage or fleeing on foot. Among the survivors gathered at the edge of the village, many pondered in confusion how they had managed to escape before the outer walls were completely breached. Grateful for their painful testimonies, the young nobleman offered his heartfelt thanks, well aware that time was running out as danger approached. Listening quietly beside him, Jader stared into the distance, his thoughts consumed by the rising mound of monster corpses and the shadow cast by Iliano. Nearby, the young maiden rested in utter exhaustion after channeling her healing magic, forcing a fragile smile to reassure those suffering around her. Watching over her recovery, the warrior and the prince discussed their responsibilities, agreeing that concealing the truth about the dismantled barrier would be a betrayal. Stepping forward to speak to the gathered crowd, the prince announced his identity, but he was met with a frigid and distrustful silence from the villagers. He sensed the heavy atmosphere, realizing that the lingering remnants of Iliano's deceit had sown deep division between the monarchy and the common people. He turned to Mira and Jader, offering to explain the truth behind the saint who had destroyed the royal capital. But before he could delve into the past, a sudden disturbance interrupted him. A chilling sense of dread washed over them as an ominous wave of magic echoed from the distant mountains, causing Jader to snap into a defensive stance as the threat drew near. Even without magical sensitivity, the overwhelming malice sent a shudder through her core, forcing her to realize with horror that their defensive barrier had barely detected the incoming assault in time. Placing a steady hand on her shoulder, he declared that he would take the front line, warning that pushing her barrier past its absolute limits would cause it to collapse and leave the defenseless citizens exposed. Understanding the stakes, she nodded with firm resolve and focused her divine energy, expanding a protective light across the surrounding settlement to shelter the vulnerable people. Combining their strength, they raised a dual-layered barrier over the village, with her pushing her magic to its absolute limits to create a shield strong enough to buy them precious time against the impending raid. Charging ahead with fierce determination, he bellowed a battle cry at the approaching horde, while behind him, the prince watched in silent awe at the selfless bravery displayed by the young saint. Turning to the skeptical onlookers, the prince urged them to open their eyes to her sacrifice, warning that if this defensive line fell, no one in the village would survive the coming onslaught. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the villagers debated among themselves, torn between their deep-seated trauma from past betrayals and the undeniable reality of the magical shield holding off their doom. An elder villager finally spoke up, urging his neighbors to stop their bitter accusations and face reality, acknowledging that their own desperation had allowed them to be manipulated before, and that running away was no longer an option. He had laid bare the uncomfortable truth, leaving the refugees to face their own selfishness. Amidst the quiet murmurs, one of the men spoke up, admitting that while they had resented the secrecy and lashed out in fear, there was no denying that Mira had continuously protected them all along. The villager continued, acknowledging that nobody needed to share the exact same feelings or suddenly trust everything, but doing nothing in the face of such sacrifice was no longer an option. Driven by a newfound resolve, the man declared firmly that he wanted to repay the kindness and protection he had received. As the mood among the refugees shifted, Jader walked alongside Mira, explaining their immediate tactical objective. Since the monsters hunting the civilians were limited in number, they should minimize further damage by settling the battle swiftly. He outlined the strategy, recalling how Dairo's rogue soldiers had been repelled before. With the enemy now concentrating their assault on the southern breach, they needed to draw them into a single funnel point. By deliberately narrowing the barrier's output and creating a designated opening at the village entrance, they could concentrate the defensive barrier strength while channeling the monster horde directly into the waiting forces inside. He further explained that once enough magical energy accumulated, the gathered monsters could be purified in one clean sweep, though he cautioned that manipulating such complex barrier adjustments would place an immense burden on her. Noticing her concern for Prince Raoul's safe return home, he offered a confident smile, reassuring her that she could leave the heavy burden of the front line entirely to him. Their conversation was interrupted as the bearded refugee and several villagers stepped forward, asking if even ordinary people like them could do something to help rather than remaining helpless bystanders. Touched by their willingness to stand together, she looked back at them with warmth as he accepted their offer, knowing that every bit of assistance would help secure their survival. She placed her hands on her hips with a confident smile, reassuring the crowd that there was nothing to fear as long as she stood with them. Inspired by her spirit, Prince Raoul turned to the village elder and the gathering of refugees, offering his sincere gratitude and promising to repay their support. He humbly acknowledged his own limits, admitting that alone he was merely an ordinary man, yet declaring that working for their sake gave him strength he never knew he possessed. Listening closely, Jader and the surrounding men agreed, realizing that repaying Myra's grace was not a swift gesture, but a long effort to nurture and expand the peace she was protecting. Joining their voices, Mira and the prince called upon everyone to care for one another and help rebuild the kingdom of Reuteras from the ashes of disaster. Suddenly, a violent rumble vibrated through the earth as screeching calls shattered the moment, driving Jader to draw his weapon and bellow for everyone to take up their positions. Raising his hand in a passionate rallying call, Prince Raoul swore that not a single life among them would be sacrificed today. With a fierce crash, the monstrous horde burst into the choke point, where Jader and the front line braced themselves to engage in deadly combat. Jader confessed his own vulnerability, admitting that he too had been frightened and searching for something to lean on amidst the uncertainty. Meanwhile, dark waves of monstrous beasts surged across the land, threatening to overwhelm the entire territory in a relentless swarm. On the chaotic front line, brave defenders slashed through the shadowy fiends, fighting desperately to hold back the tide of darkness. High above the chaos, Mira unleashed her holy aura to push back the encroaching shadows, while commanders below shouted tactics, coordinating rotating shifts to maintain a steady defensive line against the endless horde. He struck down a monster with a swift blow, reminding himself that while the saints' power alleviated their burden, he could not afford to become naive or overly reliant on her blessing. Haunted by painful memories, he recalled the agonizing moment years ago when he was left as the sole survivor, feeling hopelessly weak despite the heavy trust placed upon him. For 10 long years, he had pressed onward alone in pursuit of genuine strength, determined never again to stand powerless while tragedy unfolded around him. Floating above the battlefield, Mira carefully regulated her divine magic to cleanse the corruption step by step, knowing full well that overexerting herself in haste would lead to catastrophic failure. Back on the front lines, Jader coordinated seamlessly with his fellow warriors, keeping a sharp eye on the battlefield as they executed their defensive strategy. He slashed through the encroaching shadow beasts alongside his comrades, glancing up toward the saint's divine light with newfound conviction. As the tide of battle raged, the nearby soldiers voiced their desperation, questioning whether help would truly reach them before they were completely overrun. In that moment of intense pressure, his mind drifted back to when he had reached out to her, extending a hand before courage could even take hold. Turning to his comrades with fiery resolve, he shouted for them to trust him, guaranteeing that salvation would arrive, his conviction instilling instant confidence in their weary hearts. He realized that the child trapped in isolation and darkness back then had been his own reflection all along. He remembered how deeply he had longed for someone to listen to his pain and carry the burden alongside him, so he would no longer have to suffer alone. But when her gentle hand had held his, he finally felt truly seen and understood, as if he had at last discovered his real self. Recharged by this profound realization, he leaped high into the air, his blade slicing through a monster in a single decisive strike as he vowed to save them all. Mira watches in awe as the allied soldiers press the attack, galvanized by Prince Raoul's formidable display on the front lines. The troops rally with renewed vigor, shouting words of encouragement as decade-long struggles finally seemed to reach a turning point. Amidst the fallen dark creatures, veteran warriors stand guard over the cleared ground, impressed by the magnetic charisma and leadership that brought them together. They reflect on how far they have come, acknowledging the quiet strength of those who stood by them throughout the long hardship. Nearby, Jader moves like a shadow across the field, his blades severing dark beasts in a lightning-fast streak of motion. Having witnessed his skill, the seasoned fighters exchange quiet nods, recalling how many lives he has saved with that unfaltering resolve. They take comfort in knowing such steadfast allies are fighting at their side. Spotting a distant flash, Mira recognizes it as the signal to retreat, while Jader issues firm instructions to slowly fall back without overextending. Turning back toward her, he offers a look of complete confidence, assuring her that she can trust him implicitly to keep everyone safe. With effortless grace, he leaps through the air, felling another monstrous foe before touching down with sharp precision. However, as Mira attempts to unleash her magic to support him, a sudden crushing pressure weighs upon her, paralyzing her spells just as colossal, twisted limbs erupt from the earth. The obsidian armor of the central creature cracks open with a sickening crunch, glowing intensely as a sinister mutation takes hold. Before them looms a fully transformed variant beast, radiating pure malice and covered in razor-sharp obsidian spikes, ready to turn the tide of battle. On the battlefield, Jader crouched low, blood trickling from his mouth as the relentless pressure and towering shadow of the beast loomed over him. Watching him endure the ordeal, Myra's thoughts drifted back to Prince Raoul and the heavy burden he had always carried. Ever since her birth as the saintess in the royal capital, she had believed it was only natural to be sought after, while Raoul had put on a facade to meet everyone's expectations. She realized that if Raoul had not accepted her fragile, cracking self back then, she might have remained lost in deep conflict forever. Because this journey had brought her true joy, and because Raoul had seen her off, she could finally understand her own genuine feelings. Reaching out in her heart, she felt profound gratitude, thankful from the bottom of her soul that she had met him. Yet now, facing the threat before them, she embraced the special power she possessed, realizing its true purpose. Gathering her strength, her posture shifted as determination filled every fiber of her being for Raoul's sake. Overcoming the crushing magic pressure, an explosive surge of holy aura burst from her body as she declared that Raoul had resolved to return home to protect everyone. With her eyes blazing and magic crackling violently around her, she roared at the dark beast to stay out of their way. Her blinding light shattered the dark beast, breaking its monolithic frame apart until nothing remained of the shadowy menace. As the monster dissolved, a colossal pillar of holy energy surged into the sky, piercing the clouds and purifying the entire landscape for miles around. With every last thread obliterated in an instant, she stood quietly in the quiet breeze, catching her breath with her eyes gently closed. Jader collapsed onto the grass and laughed with sheer relief, openly admiring her breathtaking display of power and how effortlessly she had wiped the field clean. Jader sits bound in iron chains within the damp, secluded confines of the dungeon, reflecting bitterly on how a single interaction brought him to this dismal end. Outside his cell, Eliano presses her face against the iron bars, loudly complaining about the lack of snacks provided to the prisoners while he watches her with quiet resignation. Undeterred by their captivity, she eagerly boasts about how she managed to charm a guard into sharing secrets simply by learning his name and offering daily greetings. She continues her lively rant, recounting her childhood in a miserable orphanage where the only prospects were being sold into service or forced into the military. Her memories trace back to those cramped, filthy quarters where children huddled in the dark, fed on hollow promises and strange teachings while enduring hunger. Yet amid the squalor, the young girl found solace in the magical rhythm of fairy tales, clinging to radiant words that promised a world far beyond her grim reality. Her turn of fate came unexpectedly when she was suddenly declared a saint and taken in by a nobleman, a twist that felt like a grand story brought to life. Listening to her story, he admits feeling a faint envy of her ability to view their situation with optimism, though she playfully confesses she was simply slacking off. His expression darkens as he stares through the bars, questioning whether she truly believed he lacked the resolve to take action. Slumping down against the stone wall on the opposite side of his cell, she chuckles softly and reminds him that if that is the case, he owes an apology to everyone involved. She urged him to focus on survival first, suggesting that if they managed to escape their confinement, they could figure out their future then, because as long as they were alive, hope remained. He quietly agreed with her logic. He reminded her that her past actions had real consequences, pointing out that others, including Marilyn, had their lives upended. She casually dismissed the accusation, countering that Marilyn was simply following orders from the prince and the count. She then offered a surprisingly bright proposal, promising that she would make sure Marilyn apologized alongside her once they were free. Listening to her banter about how a sincere apology could smooth things over, he pondered her unwavering spirit. Though initially skeptical, he found himself considering her idea to make amends. He recalled the solemn words of the high priest, who had once taught him that every individual possesses a predetermined role in the world and that accepting one's place is a worthy path. Returning his thoughts to the gloomy dungeon cell, he clumsily attempted the foolish apology gesture she had mentioned, asking if that was what she meant. She burst into laughter at his awkward attempt, enthusiastically declaring him ready for whatever life brought next, while he looked out from behind the iron bars with renewed resolve. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the surrounding lands were recovering from the recent battle, with villagers and refugees hard at work restoring their homes and replanting fields under the saint's protection. Nearby, the battle-hardened mercenaries gathered to celebrate their flawless victory without a single casualty, relieved that the threat had passed and their hard work was done. Grasping arms with a fellow warrior, he accepted his comrade's hearty praise, quietly reflecting on what it meant to stand shoulder to shoulder with such rough allies in defense of the realm. He reached out to offer his hand to Prince Raoul, offering a warm farewell while lightheartedly agreeing to work together again, provided the compensation was better next time. Turning toward Mira, the prince observed her miraculous recovery, marveling at how she appeared perfectly healthy despite having temporarily exhausted her divine powers. Watching the villagers celebrate around them, he reflected on the mythical scale of their victory, knowing this battle would be retold as a legend in the realm for generations to come. She humbly downplayed her role in the legend, pointing out that it was his leadership that truly united the people, though he quietly admitted he had merely orchestrated the stage while everyone fought together for survival. Continuing her thoughts, she praised Jader's vital presence during the crisis, emphasizing that his talent and deep empathy were exactly what the populace needed in their darkest hour. Listening to her words, he gazed into the distance with newfound resolve, declaring that this victory was merely the beginning of his duty to stand tall and lead the kingdom forward. Flustered by his sudden surge of emotion, he blushed and timidly asked if she would allow him to remain by her side. Overcome with embarrassment, he suddenly backtracked with a flushed face, declaring that once he became a man truly worthy of standing beside her, he would ask for her hand in marriage once more. Before she could answer, he bowed deeply in a frantic apology for his outburst and rushed away as fast as his legs could carry him. Staring blankly in his wake, she wondered what he had been trying to say, only to be snapped back to reality when villagers hurried over to request her aid in healing the remaining injured. She answered enthusiastically, affirming that her work was far from over. Even with her magic depleted, there were still countless ways she could help those in need. Walking along the quiet path, she pondered the imminent arrival of her older brother, wondering if she would soon be escorted back to the capital, though worries about the lingering damage to the village still weighed on her heart. Gazing toward the chapel, she realized that this might mean parting ways with Raoul and bringing an end to their brief, yet eventful days of adventure together. With a soft smile, she mused on how remarkably similar the royal brothers truly were in both spirit and stature. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the pitch-black shadows, a tall man with a sinister grin, his long white mantle fluttering as he declared that this long, tedious farce had finally come to an end. Prince Arthur dismissed the attendant with cold authority, instructing her to leave so he could speak directly, prompting the terrified woman to bow nervously and scurry away. As the villager hastily fled, muttering in fear about fake saints and deception, she dropped her belongings, unable to withstand the overwhelming pressure of Prince Arthur's presence. Turning his gaze toward her, Arthur's expression twisted into an unhinged, maniacal leer as he hissed that he had been dying to meet her. Before she could even react, Arthur lunged forward with terrifying speed, striking from behind with unhinged malice, leaving her crying out for Raoul as dark hands reached out to seize her. High above the castle courtyard, the young prince observed the quiet girl resting among the flowers with her beloved stuffed bear. Approaching her with formal grace, he offered a polite bow, introducing himself as first Prince Arthur of the Kingdom of Roidas. He marveled aloud at her radiant silver hair, declaring that its beauty rivaled the moonlight itself, and confirming his father's words that a saint was truly a manifestation of light. Continuing his impassioned speech, the boy spoke of the encroaching darkness and miasma threatening their realm, emphasizing how a true saint serves as a beacon of hope so the populace never stumbles in fear. With fervor in his eyes, he declared his ambition to become the guiding light for his kingdom, asking to stand by her side as they led the people together. Touched by his sincerity, she admitted with a gentle smile that these kind words were the greatest gift she could receive, as he was the very first friend she had ever made outside the castle walls. Wishing to honor their newfound connection, she softly offered him a gesture of friendship in return to commemorate their meeting. She pledged to treasure those words forever, though the warmth of that cherished memory dissolved into the cold, harsh reality of the present. Opening her eyes, she found herself lying on a rigid bed inside a gloomy chamber, every inch of her body aching from the ordeal as a shadowed figure stood near the window. Looking down at her without a trace of his former warmth, he coldly explained that her banishment was intentional, declaring that a useless fake saint who brought only disgrace had no place beside him. He walked back and forth, boasting that the populace was thoroughly satisfied with banishment rather than execution, taking comfort in pushing uncomfortable truths out of sight. Continuing his tirade, the prince mocked the ungrateful crowd who profited from miracles yet turned back to complain, mindlessly swayed by whichever voice shouted the loudest. His expression twisted into a sharp, sinister smirk as he spat out that even flesh and blood children would deceive others with hypocritical righteousness. Staring back at him in stunned silence, she listened as he insisted that observing the masses only exposed their sheer ignorance, proving that leading them possessed no true value. Suddenly altering his demeanor, he turned toward her with dramatic flair, proclaiming that her compassion remained an irreplaceable beacon and that this reunion had opened his eyes. Reaching out a gentle hand, the prince proposed renewing their engagement, promising that together they would show the people a genuine bond and save them all. Remaining motionless with her teddy bear clutched to her chest, she listened as he declared his desire to display their united front before the citizens and her elder brother. Deep in thought, she realized that an ideal was not merely a final destination, but a fresh starting point that required stopping to reevaluate one's path. With a smug smile, he brushed off any grand notions of moralizing, claiming this was simply the culmination and true beginning of his personal journey. Eyes shadowed beneath her bangs, she silently acknowledged that although his ruthless treatment was absurd and infuriating, she had already come to terms with her fate. She offered a gentle, self-deprecating smile, recalling how her desire to help others had brought her genuine courage and purpose, even when her future seemed uncertain. Impressed by her serene composure, the prince clapped his hands in theatrical admiration, praising her nobility and declaring how marvelous her sentiment was. Looking directly into his eyes with absolute clarity, she simply expressed her quiet contentment at having met him. Turning her back on him to walk away, she realized that providing solace and compassion to those in despair was a simple task, exactly as it had been before. Her peaceful departure rattled the prince to his core. Cold sweat broke out across his face as he panicked, desperately wondering why another noble was involved and why she had so callously abandoned her cherished ideals. As she continued toward the exit with calm steps, he shouted after her, demanding to know if she had truly discarded her principles or if she simply failed to understand the populace. He vehemently insisted that she was mistaken, accusing her of shallow vanity, yet he could not hide the pale terror that washed over his face when recalling the king's absolute decree. Pausing her movement, she turned her head slightly to observe his unraveling state, calmly asking why he was so visibly terrified and pointing out that while she harbored no fear, he clearly failed to comprehend his own terror. She unmasked his deepest insecurity, explaining that he surrounded himself only with those he could look down upon to reassure his fragile ego, completely terrified of advancing or seeing himself through the eyes of others. Completely unraveling under her piercing words, the prince recoiled in hysterics, screaming at her to stop, refusing to permit her actions, and ordering her never to come near him again, while the calm noble stood quietly in the background. He cowered on the stone floor, trembling, while she stood composed, explaining that she harbored no hatred toward him. Rather, confronting fear to bring peace was a choice she had deliberately made. Looking across the grand chapel, she noted that she needed to observe everything firsthand to understand what he was truly trying to protect. Turning her gaze back to him, she posed one final question, asking whether he still cherished the stuffed toy from his past. His mind reeled in utter bewilderment at her question, unable to comprehend how she could possibly know about the plush toy he kept secret. Acknowledging that forgiving his past actions outright would be unfair, she nevertheless offered to help him if he truly wished to start anew. Reaching out toward him, she explicitly offered her hand not as a subordinate, but as an equal, as a genuine friend. Memories of their past flickered between them before she bade him a polite farewell and quietly walked away, leaving him stunned. Before he could even register her departure, Jaider loomed directly behind him with a cold, menacing aura, demanding an explanation. Without giving him a chance to respond, the formidable warrior delivered a swift, decisive strike that knocked him instantly unconscious. With the prince collapsed cold on the stone floor, the warrior approached her, asking if she was unharmed, to which she gently replied that she was merely tired after wading through the conversation. She listened quietly as Jaider asked if she was finally satisfied with how things had ended, giving a simple nod in response. Looking down at the unconscious prince, Jaider reflected quietly that Arthur was once just like himself, a fragile soul who couldn't bring himself to trust anyone, least of all his own heart. As they stood over the fallen prince, Lloyd made swift arrangements, noting that additional guards and the Ida's group had already arrived at the grounds. He advised binding the prince immediately to prevent any further disturbance or commotion before the area could be fully secured. Turning back to her, Jaider reminded her of the resolve she had declared from the very beginning, that no matter what transpired, she would not shed a single tear over this ordeal. He praised her warmly, acknowledging that she had fulfilled her vow completely without wavering. With a bright, unburdened smile, she confirmed his words, feeling a deep sense of relief now that the heavy weight on her chest had finally lifted. Meanwhile, back in the quiet room, her beloved plush teddy bear rested alone on the neatly made bed, left behind as a silent testament to the past she had finally moved beyond. A carriage rolled quietly along a shaded forest road, carrying heavy thoughts on the relentless passage of time and the desperate wish that past mistakes could be undone. Inside the moving coach, the discussion centered on Prince Arthur's recent behavior, noting how his attempt to speak candidly had only resulted in an awkward distance that masked his true motives. Seated in the dim interior, the elderly statesman weighed his options, knowing that offering empty apologies instead of maintaining royal composure would undermine his authority, even as a faint trace of bitter relief touched his features. He acknowledged the harsh reality that no amount of wishing could reverse time, reasoning that as long as the populace accepted Arthur's public stance, the prince's duty was fulfilled. Turning to his young confidant, he questioned whether it was arrogant to expect veteran leaders to change their resolve, suggesting that Arthur should face the kingdom's future as he was, even if it meant remaining bound to Mira. He reasoned that Arthur's dynamic with Mira was inherently poisoned by lingering resentment toward her father, leaving the prince no choice but to feign ignorance and treat her with calculated hospitality. As the carriage journeyed deeper into the woods, he reflected that whether Arthur's conduct was a calculated facade or genuine devotion, sustaining it to the very end would turn it into undisputed history. He mused solemnly that expecting such flawless performance might be overly ambitious, contemplating the heavy burden weighing upon King Loidas. Having voiced these grave doubts, he turned directly toward his companion, ready to discard all remaining pretense and speak without reservation. In response, Lloyd met his gaze with a faint, calm smile, remarking that attempting to orchestrate an escape while the entire royal apparatus remained paralyzed was an extraordinarily brazen gamble. He argued inside the carriage that placing Myra's political marriage above basic royal duty was putting the cart before the horse, though living in peaceful ignorance might indeed be a form of happiness, so long as nothing went awry. The elderly king listened in grim silence, questioning whether relying on sheer luck after failing to resolve the crisis truly fulfilled one's duty, and asking if he was expected to approve a scheme that exploited both his precious son and Mira for national gains. Remaining composed, he looked directly at King Loidas, pointing out how transparent and flawed the old ruler's scheming truly was. Suddenly, a noise echoed from outside, prompting him to glance back with a subtle smirk and remark that their conversation seemed to have drawn quite an audience. Stepping out of the carriage clad in resplendent royal armor and a heavy fur mantle, he instructed the assembled troops to be at ease while Jiter and Mira knelt respectfully in greeting, realizing the truth of his presence. He affectionately tapped Mira on the head, expressing relief at her safety and apologizing for the hardships she endured, playfully blaming his hard armor when she winced. Turning toward Jiter, he suggested that it was finally time for them to speak openly, receiving a dry, knowing response from the guard. Bewildered by his sudden appearance, the young girl spoke up, asking how long he had actually been nearby without them realizing it. He admitted that he had been monitoring them from the very beginning, explaining that while his formal duties prevented him from walking beside them directly, he had stayed informed through intermediaries. Gathering inside a Grand Command tent, he ordered the guards to clear the area so they could hear Myra's true wishes before deciding their next move, warmly offering to pour tea as they sat down. He reviewed the tactical battlefield reports, which detailed how the modest garrison of 15 adventurers stationed in the area had been far too small to halt the advance of the invading monster horde before the royal army arrived. Because of these dire conditions, an urgent request for backup had to be routed through covert scouts embedded within the ranks, who maintained secret methods to communicate with headquarters. Reflecting on this complex web of messages over tea, Jiter recalled the moment Mira disclosed her true background, wondering how her letter could have safely reached the monarch in Idas while her location remained hidden. The answer had begun to piece itself together following the dragon battle, when he received several urgent dispatches while the young girl was still resting. Among those dispatches, embedded soldiers had personally requested that he safeguard her, confirming that her network relied on high levels of implicit trust among its members. In response to their curiosity, the young lord explained that long-distance communication magic lacked high precision and required specialized relay stations and human coders to successfully transmit messages. It was then revealed that Toel had acted as her dedicated relay point after the exile, though an unexpected landslide caused by a sudden storm had temporarily separated her from the rendezvous point. Since Toel was trained strictly as a receiver, she had been unable to initiate outbound communications herself, leaving her with no choice but to await rescue after the calamity. Upon learning of these hardships, Mira comforted her loyal companion, expressing heartfelt gratitude and relief that she had successfully reunited with their allies without coming to harm. With a reassuring smile, the aristocratic general concluded that receiving her heartfelt letter had recalled her true essence, prompting him to personally offer her a seat of honor and protection within his ranks. He pointed out how Raoul had taken a wide detour, keeping his distance on horseback while tracking their movements from afar to avoid detection. Continuing their assessment, the guard commander questioned why Raoul had maintained such a distance and avoided making direct contact throughout the journey, a point the young noble silently acknowledged. Around the table, the discussion turned to Prince Arthur's roundabout actions, wondering if his hesitation stemmed from fear, while affirming that Mira remained a cherished sister and royal figure to her brother. With a calm expression, he remarked that a stern reprimand was necessary to bring the prince back to reason. Meanwhile, down in the shadowy depths of the cathedral's underground storeroom, Prince Arthur sat slumped against the cold stone wall, beaten and discarded like forgotten cargo. Reaching out with a trembling hand, he reflected bitterly on how his life had been manipulated from afar by forces that kept him wrapped around their finger. In the suffocating darkness, he confronted his own cowardice, realizing he had been too terrified to take a single step forward, afraid of seeing his true self through the eyes of others. His gaze remained hollow and bruised, stripped of all royal pride as he wallowed in the harsh reality of his downfall. Outside his cell bars, a gentle figure appeared, prompting him to look up and confess the quiet jealousy he had harbored for so long. He brooded over the inescapable disparity between the first and second princes, recognizing that his entire identity had been shaped by what was expected and given to him, leaving him powerless to change his fate. He sat slumped against the cold dungeon wall, weighed down by his own insecurities, while Lloyd stood before him, acknowledging how Arthur had always viewed himself. Looking down at his bound brother, Lloyd admitted a truth he had long kept hidden, that he had always longed to become just like him. Arthur's eyes widened in disbelief as Lloyd declared his intention to accomplish what neither Arthur nor their father had been able to achieve. Having requested that the ropes on Arthur's hands be loosened, Lloyd passed a letter through the wooden bars, asking him to read it so he could stand proud on his own, promising to return soon. Overwhelmed by the unexpected warmth and burden of his brother's words, the imprisoned prince stared back in stunned silence, emotion welling in his gaze. As Lloyd turned and walked away down the dimly lit corridor, Arthur stretched his hand out through the bars, helpless to stop him. Left alone in the quiet cell, he slumped back against the masonry, softly muttering for his brother to do as he pleased. Elsewhere, Lloyd rejoined King Loidas, who expressed his sincere gratitude toward the young noble for his gentle tact and dedication. The elderly king noted that a monarch cannot truly judge himself. Only those capable of objective critique can, and now that their resolve was aligned, they would press onward together. King Loidas insisted on bearing the brunt of the unthankful burden himself, reminding Lloyd that since he was the one who initiated this path, he would see it through. He mused quietly on the fate of the young saintess, reflecting that even if everything had been orchestrated from the start, it would be best if she could live out her life in peace, completely unaware of the dark truths behind her role. He accepted that he was no different from past rulers who had used the saintesses for their own ends, acknowledging with a somber smile that the curse of such ruthlessness belonged solely to him. Seated at his desk with a glass in hand, the king laid out his final arrangements, entrusting full authority over the territory's immediate affairs to Jiter while sealing confidential letters to ensure a smooth transition. Lloyd noted that such harsh realities served as invaluable preparation for a future ruler, asserting his own willingness to be relentless, a sentiment the elderly monarch grimly affirmed. Turning his gaze toward the waiting carriage, he harbored lingering regrets, silently apologizing to Jiter for failing to protect his mother and for leaving Arthur wrapped in painful illusions. Entrusting the country's future to those left behind, the departing monarch made one final selfish request, asking that Jiter watch over Arthur so the young prince would never suffer in total solitude. The burden weighed heavily on Jiter, who absorbed the solemn charge with quiet sorrow, knowing full well the pain of losing any member of his cherished family. Standing amidst the towering stone pillars of the palace, he looked ahead to the long, arduous road of reconstruction and governance that now rested entirely upon his shoulders. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, Lloyd reassured Mira that he would lend her all his support, promising to be a loving elder brother and model ruler as the carriage was made ready for their journey. Elsewhere, laborers worked diligently to clear the barrier, carrying out the task not merely by royal decree, but as a personal request from an elder brother. He acknowledged the heavy burden borne by those keeping dangerous secrets, noting that neither Arthur nor King Loidas could be easily blamed. Closing his eyes, he reassured her that no forgiveness was needed, taking full responsibility for investigating the matter himself. She offered a gentle smile in response, reminding him that she had assured him from the start that she did not mind. He smiled warmly, reflecting on how remarkably she had grown over the past year and how surprised her mother would be. Taking their leave, they walked side by side toward the waiting carriage to begin their journey onward. During the journey, he reviewed reports regarding Arthur's search, analyzing conflicting details about a girl named Mary and her supposed saintly powers. The reports explained that a protective charm created by Mary enabled Arthur to reach the village, prompting a local count to adopt her as a saintess. He deduced that the talisman held only faint residual power, just enough to deceive the gullible count. Shifting attention to the capital, His informants reported that monsters had overrun the royal domain, leaving virtually no trace of survivors. Connecting these discoveries, he concluded that identifying Elaine, the saintess of the Black Ring, was essential to unraveling King Loida's true scheme. His mind pieced together every scattered fragment of truth, knowing that even the faint traces left behind would eventually expose the full extent of the conspiracy. Bound by duty, the prince swore upon the honored name of his house that no sacrifice or clue would be wasted, receiving a resolute affirmation in return. As troops gathered to secure the capital, the presence of Lord Raoul, heir to the kingdom of Liadai, proved to be their greatest asset, a key witness to Elaine's treachery alongside the awakening of holy power. Reflecting on their next destination, he suggested offering formal protection and gratitude before setting off for Liadai, though he acknowledged that their own nation was still in dire need of aid. Given the lingering threat and unknown motives of their enemies, the prince insisted on acting as her personal shield, refusing to leave her exposed to potential danger. She thoughtfully replied that protecting one another mutually was their strongest defense, keeping their shared resolve steadfast amidst the uncertainty. Clutching her small plush bear, she gently explained that while a carriage was prepared to send a letter to her mother, she intended to continue her journey here, leaving Jiter to oversee the fragile transition after the king's fall. Hearing her firm decision, the prince expressed his gratitude for her watchfulness while reminding her of her official duties and how much her family worried for her well-being. Surprised by her cheerful tone, her companion teased her with a light-hearted smile, wondering where she had picked up such formal phrasing. Recognizing the wisdom in their plan, the nobles agreed to rebuild their network of support, entrusting Lord Raoul to strengthen their alliance for the trials ahead. He spoke to her with gentle warmth, reminding her that no matter where her journey took her, she would always have a home to return to. With a bright, clear smile, she expressed her heartfelt gratitude to the man who had truly become like an elder brother to her. As their moment of quiet farewell concluded, someone suddenly tugged at Raoul's coat, calling out to ask where he was hurrying off to so abruptly. Walking alongside his companions, Raoul explained that he needed to oversee the preparations for the grand ceremonial welcome awaiting Mira upon her eventual return. Observing his firm determination, the others chuckled, noting how much he had matured, though his overbearing persistence was starting to resemble someone very familiar. Meanwhile, as they set off on the open path, Jiter voiced his lingering concern, asking if she was truly certain about continuing on this road. She laughed softly, reminding him with a playful bounce in her step that their contract bound them together until he safely escorted her to the border. Flustered by her cheerful reply, the dark-haired warrior abruptly turned his face away with a grumble, trying to hide his embarrassment. When she curiously asked why he was looking away, he stammered that he had simply been recalling an ancient detail. He recalled how in ancient lore, the true saintess carried alternate titles in regional legends, names preserved only in scattered historical fragments across distant lands. Turning back to meet her gaze with a sincere expression, he remarked that such a title suited her far better than the painful label of fake saintess. Bathed in the soft sunlight, Mira stood tall and serene, no longer defined by the lies of the past, but recognized now by the true title that fit her soul, the saintess